At the northernmost tip of the empire lay a land infamous for its bleak climate, unforgiving wilderness, and constant danger, a place where only the strongest could survive. It was the territory ruled by the prestigious House Vorioti, and its current lord was Duke Peliot Vorioti. The mere mention of his name was enough to make people either admire him or tremble in fear. The Duke possessed a face that carried an extraordinary presence for two completely different reasons. The first was his breathtaking beauty, a level of perfection that seemed almost unreal. The second was the overwhelming ferocity that radiated from every feature of his face. Having been born into House Vorioti, he had inherited the nickname Black Beast from the very beginning of his life. His infernal gaze alone looked capable of taking someone's life without him ever having to draw a weapon. Beneath his subtly shimmering black hair rested a pair of pitch-black eyes that seemed to swallow all warmth around them. His sharp nose, perfectly sculpted jawline, lightly colored lips with just the right amount of fullness, exceptionally well-trained physique, and naturally proud bearing combined to create an appearance that was impossible to ignore. Naturally, he was also one of only two Grand Dukes in the entire empire, a man whose existence was responsible for countless sleepless nights among the noble ladies throughout the capital and beyond. As the preparations to leave the capital were underway, the Duke calmly announced that their business there had concluded and ordered everyone to prepare for their return to the north. His assistant respectfully acknowledged the command and assured him that all the necessary arrangements would be made immediately. However, before they could depart, the Duke unexpectedly added that he would also be adopting a child. The announcement left his assistant completely stunned. Unable to hide his confusion, he cautiously wondered if this was some kind of imperial joke. The Duke responded with his usual cold expression, asking why he would ever bother making such a joke before firmly stating that he was indeed serious about adopting a child. And just like that, everything began. Their search eventually led them to an orphanage located in the western region of the empire. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building, a small child instinctively flinched. The very moment the child laid eyes upon Duke Peliot, she burst into tears as loudly as she possibly could. Even the Duke himself appeared slightly embarrassed by the reaction, while everyone around desperately tried to comfort the frightened child. Growing increasingly impatient, the Duke asked how much longer he would have to endure this. His assistant gently reminded him that this entire situation was the result of his own orders. He even remarked that this must surely be a new record. The Duke questioned what he meant, only for the assistant to explain that every single child had started crying the instant they saw his Grace's face. This was already the 15th orphanage they had visited, and not a single child had managed to stay calm in front of him. The assistant nervously added that even the Duke's gaze alone was enough to terrify them, calling it quite an impressive achievement. Hearing that only reminded the Duke that his sword had not tasted blood in quite some time. The casual remark immediately sent chills running down his assistant's spine. Forcing an awkward smile, he quickly responded that it truly was an impressive display worthy of great respect, while inwardly complaining about how arrogant these children seemed to be. Deep inside, however, he silently cursed his own fate and questioned whether the Duke genuinely wanted to adopt a child at all. His thoughts drifted back to an earlier conversation the Duke had shared with Count Carnes Rene. Overflowing with excitement, Count Carnes Rene had proudly announced that his son had spoken his very first word the other day. Every time the little boy saw him, he called him Dada, and he confessed that hearing it absolutely melted his heart every single time. He then happily spoke about how devoted his eldest child was to his brother, saying that watching the two of them together was one of the sweetest sights imaginable. Completely uninterested, Duke Peliot coldly told him to keep rambling like that if he wanted to lose his voice. Ignoring the remark, his brother insisted that the Duke simply did not understand. He then asked when Peliot intended to get married. Without even changing his expression, the Duke answered that it would happen once his brother was dead. Rather than feeling offended, his brother laughed and enthusiastically suggested that they should become brothers by marriage. The Duke was left completely speechless by the ridiculous proposal. His brother continued, insisting that once someone experienced the joy of having a sweet little child, there would be absolutely no turning back. Peliot glanced at his foolish expression and told him to look at his own face before making such absurd claims again. Still lovingly holding his baby, his brother smiled warmly and declared that becoming a father was one of the most sublime experiences in the world. Every time he held his child in his arms, his heart overflowed with love, and he sincerely hoped that one day Peliot would experience those same feelings himself. That conversation echoed through the Duke's mind while he continued visiting orphanages. Returning to the present, the Duke asked whether he had already met every child in the orphanage. His assistant confirmed that, including the last child, he had now met all 18 children. The Duke immediately ordered them to proceed to the next orphanage, and his assistant respectfully acknowledged the command. As they prepared to leave, the assistant quietly wondered to himself why His Grace did not simply get married instead of going through all of this trouble. Before they could depart, the head of the orphanage hurried over and bowed deeply before the Duke, apologizing for failing to serve him to his satisfaction. He praised the children for being so lovely and remarked that perhaps the happiest days of their lives had already passed now that they had the honor of meeting His Grace. He then hesitantly mentioned that winter was rapidly approaching and feared the children might not survive the harsh season. The assistant immediately recognized the obvious attempt to secure financial support from the Duke. Looking around at the neglected facilities, he could easily tell that the orphanage's director had very little interest in properly caring for the place, and he strongly doubted the next orphanage would be any different. Without another word, the Duke simply ordered them to leave. Just then, loud shouting erupted nearby. A young child struggled fiercely while a man tightly restrained her. She continuously yelled for him to let go, desperately trying to break free. Suddenly, she managed to escape from his grasp and immediately ran straight toward the Duke and his group. The orphanage staff desperately called out to stop her, but it was already too late. The assistant watched in complete shock. Unlike every other child they had encountered, she was not crying at the sight of the Duke. Even more surprising was the fact that both her hair and eyes were black, almost identical to the Duke's own features. The head of the orphanage hurriedly apologized, promising that he would remove the troublesome child immediately. Before anyone could do so, the Duke called out to his assistant, Lippert. Understanding the unspoken command, Lippert quickly informed him that the girl had not been included on the official list of children. The orphanage head nervously explained that it was because she was ill-mannered, constantly caused trouble, and therefore had been intentionally left out. Lippert sternly questioned how he dared deceive the Duke, reminding him that His Grace had specifically requested to meet every single child living in the orphanage. Terrified, the orphanage head immediately fell to the floor, repeatedly begging for forgiveness while bowing as low as he possibly could. Throughout the entire exchange, the young girl remained completely silent as she observed everything unfolding before her eyes. The Duke finally directed his attention toward her and calmly asked for her name. She honestly replied that she did not have one. The Duke pointed out that even children born in orphanages were usually given names. She explained that all the adults called her Nia, but she hated that name. The Duke observed her fearlessness and remarked that she was remarkably bold. He asked whether she even realized whose presence she was standing before and warned that such behavior could easily cost her life. Yet despite the warning, the little girl stood her ground without showing the slightest hint of fear. Looking at her unwavering expression, the Duke silently thought that she really was a little beast. He agreed that Nia did not suit her at all. After a brief moment of thought, he gave her a brand new name. From this moment onward, she would be known as Lyonia Vorioti. Lyonia Vorioti, that would be your new name. The little girl stood frozen in place, completely speechless as she processed the name that had just been given to her. After a long moment of silence, she frowned and complained that it was far too long. The Duke looked at her without the slightest change in his expression and calmly explained that Lyonia was simply her first name, then bluntly called her stupid. The child immediately flared up and loudly protested that she was not stupid. Without warning, the Duke effortlessly lifted her into his arms, though instead of calming down, she became even more aggressive, kicking, struggling, and shouting at the top of her lungs. Watching the chaotic scene unfold, the Duke coldly declared that a tutor would have to be summoned as soon as they returned to the north. Lyonia continued yelling with all her strength, wildly flailing her arms while trying to escape his grip. Lippert could only stare in complete disbelief before cautiously calling out, "Your Grace? Mister, hey!" The Duke casually poked the furious child, making her glare at him even harder. She accused him of enjoying teasing children just for fun. To everyone's surprise, the Duke admitted that this was far more entertaining than he had expected. Hearing that, Lyonia puffed out her cheeks and muttered that this old man had to be some kind of pervert. Lippert quickly tried to interrupt, completely confused by the bizarre interaction unfolding before his eyes, asking what exactly was happening. By the time he looked inside the carriage again, the Duke and the child were already sitting together. Lyonia Vorioti. The name itself carried meaning. Peliot symbolized the roar of a lion, while Lyonia represented the lion itself, making it a name that perfectly reflected House Vorioti. Among the few people in the Empire capable of speaking honestly to Duke Peliot without fear was Count Carnes Rene. During their academy days, the two men had captivated the attention of nearly every young noblewoman. If Duke Vorioti resembled a towering snow-covered mountain that inspired awe and intimidation, then Count Carnes Rene resembled a warm field filled with blooming flowers that welcomed everyone who approached him. Unlike the cold and fearsome Duke, Count Carnes could never stop talking about his beloved children. Every chance he got, he passionately boasted about them with a proud smile on his face. There was one particular sentence he repeated so frequently that it had practically engraved itself into the Duke's memory. "Being a father is so sublime." The words echoed in Pelliot's mind countless times. Back inside the carriage, the Duke instructed Lyonia to sit up straight. She immediately responded by telling him to shut up. On that particular day, the streets seemed far livelier than usual. Families filled every corner of the capital, walking together while laughing, chatting, and enjoying each other's company. Parents held the hands of their children, and every face seemed filled with genuine happiness. Lyonia quietly observed the heartwarming scene before asking if having a family was really that nice. Was that the reason he had wanted to adopt her? The Duke simply answered yes without hesitation. Lyonia, still as fierce as ever, let out another irritated growl before expressing everything that had been bothering her. Usually, she explained, people adopted children because they genuinely cared about them, because they loved children, because they had volunteered at an orphanage and formed a bond with a particular child, or because the child reminded them of someone precious they had lost. But this man had decided to adopt a child simply because he had become obsessed with something his friend had said. Was he actually serious? Was he really for real? The Duke quietly observed her animated rant before remarking that she seemed quite bothered by the situation. Lyonia immediately fired back by asking if he was stupid, then let out an exhausted sigh. Instead of becoming offended, the Duke smiled ever so slightly and commented that his one and only child certainly had a charming way of speaking. He reminded her that this was exactly what she had wanted anyway, since she had deliberately stood in his path earlier. After a brief pause, Lyonia admitted that he was right. No matter what his reasons had been, she had escaped that horrible orphanage. It had been nothing more than a desperate gamble on her part, and she never could have imagined that such incredible fortune would follow. While Lippert remained behind to complete the adoption documents with the orphanage director, Lyonia suddenly announced that she had one request. She explained that the orphanage director and several of the teachers had been embezzling the funds meant for the children. The Duke calmly replied that he had already suspected something like that. Lyonia continued without hesitation, revealing that they regularly abused the children and had recently begun speaking with a pimp. For the first time in a while, genuine surprise appeared on the Duke's face. He questioned whether she even understood what a pimp was. Puffing out her chest, Lyonia firmly replied that she knew exactly what it meant. They sold people to brothels. The Duke fell silent for a brief moment as he absorbed her words. Lyonia explained that they had been planning to hand one of the older girls over to the man, so she wanted the Duke to punish every single one of them. He asked whether she truly meant everyone. After thinking for a moment, she quickly shook her head and said that Miss Connier should be spared because she had always looked after the children. The Duke immediately asked if Miss Connier was the woman with the brown hair and the injured finger. Lyonia's eyes widened in surprise as she eagerly nodded and asked how he had known. The Duke explained that she had been the only adult there who had genuinely looked worried about Lyonia earlier. Continuing her story, Lyonia revealed that the orphanage director beat them whenever he got drunk. The Duke quietly asked if the bruise on her arm had been caused by him. She shook her head and explained that the bruise on her arm had come from a different teacher. The bruises left by the director were all on her back instead. A heavy silence settled inside the carriage before the Duke calmly asked how exactly she wanted him to punish them. Should he simply kill them? Without a moment of hesitation, Lyonia answered no. She wanted him to torture them until they begged for death. The Duke stared at the little girl in silence, unable to stop himself from wondering whether she truly was just a child. At that moment, Lippert approached the carriage window after finishing the paperwork and respectfully addressed the Duke. Pelliot called his name, and Lippert immediately responded, awaiting further orders. The Duke instructed him to remain behind. Completely caught off guard, Lippert asked for confirmation. The Duke explained that the orphanage was an incredibly filthy place and that they should help clean it up. He ordered Lippert to clean the place so thoroughly that not a single speck of dust would remain. Lippert instantly understood the hidden meaning behind those words and acknowledged the command without another question. Growing even more excited, Lyonia enthusiastically added her own suggestion. She passionately shouted that they should cut off their arms and legs while they were at it, lash their backs with leather belts, drown them in dirty dishwater, and shake every last speck of dust from the orphanage so it could never rise again. Her energetic voice echoed throughout the area before she quickly added that Miss Connier must be left unharmed because she had always been kind to the children. She even revealed that proof of all the embezzlement was hidden inside a safe concealed behind a picture frame. Listening to everything she said, the Duke quietly thought to himself that this little girl certainly had remarkable backbone. As the carriage slowly rolled away from the orphanage, the remaining staff watched it disappear into the distance. They whispered among themselves, wondering if she truly was not the Duke's biological daughter. Perhaps she had simply been hidden away until now. None of them knew the truth. Meanwhile, Lippert calmly watched the carriage disappear before turning his attention back toward the orphanage. With an emotionless expression, he quietly declared that it was time to get to work and deal with every last one of them. As the carriage continued its journey through the night, Lyonia sat quietly wrapped in a thick blanket to protect her from the cold. The warmth of the blanket did little to hide the loud rumble coming from her empty stomach. The sound echoed inside the carriage, making the silence even more noticeable. Before long, the carriage slowly came to a halt, and a gentle knock sounded against the window. The Duke calmly asked what the matter was. From outside, Dame Ravipa respectfully apologized for the unexpected stop and explained that, considering how late it had become and taking the young lady's condition into account, she believed it would be best for them to spend the night at the inn directly in front of them. Lyonia quickly protested, insisting that she was perfectly fine. Before she could continue, the Duke calmly agreed to the suggestion and ordered them to stay. Frustrated, Lyonia loudly complained that she had been the one speaking, not him. Looking at her with his usual indifferent expression, the Duke remarked that although she seemed completely drained from hunger, her vocal cords were functioning remarkably well. His comment only made the little girl even more irritated. After everyone stepped outside, the Duke looked toward Dame Ravipa and instructed her to make sure everything was prepared for their departure once Lyonia had regained her strength. Dame Ravipa respectfully acknowledged the order. As Lyonia attempted to climb down from the carriage by herself, her exhausted body suddenly lost its balance and she slipped. Everyone watching gasped in shock, but before she could hit the ground, the Duke reacted instantly and caught her effortlessly in his arms. Even Lyonia herself froze in surprise. Her entire body trembled as she stared at him with wide eyes before letting out an awkward laugh and admitting that she had almost died just then. Still shivering slightly from the scare, she looked up at him in amazement and praised his incredible reflexes. Meanwhile, Dame Ravipa quietly observed the scene in complete disbelief. Seeing the feared Duke of House Vorioti kneeling on one knee just to catch a small child was something she had never imagined witnessing. Without paying any attention to the stunned expressions around him, the Duke calmly instructed Dame Ravipa that Lyonia would be placed under her care for the night. She immediately accepted the responsibility. The Duke continued by explaining that Lyonia must first be warmed up properly before being given something to eat. Dame Ravipa assured him that she would inform the innkeeper immediately and make all the necessary preparation. Once Lyonia was gently handed over to her, the little girl curiously tilted her head and asked who she was. Smiling politely, the woman introduced herself as Mal's Ravipa and respectfully told Lyonia that she could simply call her Mal's. Lyonia's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she immediately asked if Mal's was a knight too. Mal's proudly confirmed that she was indeed a knight. Hearing that answer filled Lyonia with excitement, and she enthusiastically declared that it was incredibly cool. Watching the child react so innocently despite everything she had endured made Mal's quietly think to herself just how adorable she truly was. As Mal's carefully helped Lyonia remove her clothes in preparation for her bath, the bruises covering the little girl's back were suddenly exposed. The sight immediately caused Mal's expression to stiffen. Lyonia noticed her reaction and casually remarked that her back looked pretty bad, did it not? She quietly admitted that she only hoped the wounds would heal soon because they hurt constantly. Every single night she woke up from her sleep because simply rolling over caused the bruises to rub painfully against the bed. Before any of the old wounds could properly recover, she would always end up getting beaten all over again. Gently pouring warm water over the little girl's body, Mal softly instructed her to close her eyes. She comforted Lyonia by saying that someone as young as her should not worry too much. As long as she ate properly and got plenty of rest, her wounds would gradually heal. She also mentioned that she had a special ointment that helped injuries recover much faster because her younger brother was always getting hurt while causing trouble. After the bath, she promised to carefully apply the ointment to every bruise. Lyonia quietly looked at Mal's with an unfamiliar feeling of warmth and kindness. After a brief pause, she curiously asked if Mal's really had a younger brother. Mal smiled warmly and replied that she did, explaining that he was quite the little troublemaker and therefore managed to injure himself almost every single day. Some time later, Leonia emerged from the bath wearing clean clothes for the first time in what felt like forever. She proudly spread out her arms with a bright smile and happily announced her grand appearance with an enthusiastic ta-da. The Duke looked at her without showing the slightest hint of amazement. Completely ignoring her excitement, he bluntly stated that she was still ugly even after taking a bath. Leonia's face immediately scrunched up with frustration as she argued that nobody had even done anything to her face. Remaining perfectly calm, the Duke explained that although he had not changed anything, he was now obligated to worry about her because she was officially his child. Leonia puffed out her cheeks and shot back that he should simply deal with it because he had brought this upon himself. The Duke responded by saying that he had never once had to put up with anything in his entire life. Leonia immediately answered that this was exactly what happened when someone decided to raise a child. The two of them glared at each other with equally annoyed expressions while everyone nearby quietly watched the ridiculous exchange unfold. Later that night, after Leonia had finally fallen asleep, Mal's Ravipad gently tucked her into bed before stepping outside the room. The Duke remained seated in a chair, silently tapping his fingers against his lap while deep in thought. Breaking the silence, Mal's respectfully informed him that Leonia appeared to have suffered severe and prolonged abuse. Based on everything the young lady had revealed, it was clear that the mistreatment had continued over a very long period of time. She admitted that she had been genuinely shocked to learn Leonia's actual age because the child was far smaller than she should have been. In Mal's opinion, Leonia had almost certainly been deprived of proper meals for years, preventing her from growing normally. The Duke listened to every word without interrupting, his expression growing colder with each passing moment. After a long silence, he finally called Mal's name. She immediately responded, awaiting his orders. The Duke then gave a command in a voice so calm that it sent chills through the room. He ordered her to send word to the orphanage and have every single person who had ever raised a hand against one of the children brought to the north. They would not be judged by anyone else. He would personally receive every last one of them himself. Leonia's eyes sparkled with excitement the moment she saw herself dressed in her new clothes. She happily spun around, unable to contain her joy, and exclaimed that she had never worn anything like this before. Everything felt so soft, so clean, and so beautiful that she could hardly believe it was meant for her. Mal smiled warmly as she admired the little girl and sincerely told her that the outfit looked absolutely wonderful on her. Leonia burst into cheerful laughter, clearly overjoyed by the compliment. The Duke, however, remained completely unfazed. Looking at her with his usual indifferent expression, he casually remarked that she finally looked human, thank goodness. Leonia immediately puffed out her cheeks in frustration and loudly protested that she had always been human. She demanded to know what he meant by such a rude comment before reminding him that he was supposed to compliment her instead. The Duke calmly asked why he should compliment her when she was not even pretty. His blunt response left Leonia completely exasperated. She complained that he was unbelievably mean to her and reminded him that he was her father now. Without missing a beat, the Duke pointed out that she still insisted on calling him Mr. instead of Dad. Leonia stumbled over her words before shyly admitting that she simply was not used to calling anyone Dad yet. The Duke quietly replied that, in the same way, he was not accustomed to giving compliments either. Hearing that only made Leonia even grumpier. After watching her sulk for a moment, the Duke finally offered what he considered a compliment. If she truly wanted to hear something nice, then she should gain some weight first. Mal's, sensing that the conversation would only continue to spiral into another argument, politely excused herself and informed the Duke that she would check on the carriage. The Duke acknowledged her departure. A short while later, he looked toward Leonia and asked if she was ready to leave. She energetically nodded and answered that she was. Meanwhile, one of the assistants quietly approached Mal's and asked if something was wrong because she seemed unusually distracted. Mal softly replied that nothing was actually wrong. It was simply that His Grace's demeanor around the young miss felt somewhat different from what she was accustomed to seeing. Before she could elaborate any further, another assistant lightly laughed and asked why she was being so serious while questioning what exactly she meant by different than usual. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted when the Duke appeared carrying Leonia in his arms. Wondering why the two of them were standing in front of the doorway, he calmly asked what they were doing there. Startled by his sudden appearance, both assistants immediately stepped aside and respectfully greeted him with a good morning. Mal's quickly informed him that breakfast was still being prepared. As the Duke continued walking, Lyonia happily waved both of her hands toward the assistants, enthusiastically saying goodbye to them. The Duke casually announced that, in that case, they would simply go for a walk while waiting. The assistants watched them leave in complete confusion, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. Throughout the journey, Lyonia was treated to meals unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She ate meat for breakfast, meat again for lunch, and yet more meat for dinner. Sitting inside the carriage with the Duke, she nervously admitted that she was worried she might end up throwing up from eating so much. Without the slightest concern, the Duke simply replied that if she needed to throw up, then she should just do it. Lyonia stared at him in complete disbelief. She pointed out that the carriage looked incredibly expensive and that it would be a terrible shame to dirty it. Not only that, but it would also create unnecessary work for the people responsible for cleaning it afterward. The Duke looked at her as though she had said something absurd and asked why she was worrying about such trivial matters. He reminded her that she was now the daughter of Duke Vorioti. If one carriage became dirty, he could simply buy another one without giving it a second thought. Seeing the astonishment on Lyonia's face, he calmly added that every passing second earned him more than enough money to purchase another carriage just like this one. Lyonia's eyes widened with admiration as she excitedly declared that he really was incredibly cool. She laughed and remarked that nothing could possibly beat having money. After thinking for another moment, however, she quietly admitted that she still did not want to throw up because it hurt, no matter how wealthy someone was. She then added that true wealth should come from a person's heart rather than simply owning expensive things. The Duke dismissed her words as complete nonsense. Without hesitation, Lyonia nodded in agreement before cleverly saying that it really was nonsense, but only the kind of nonsense poor people repeated to themselves in order to cope with being poor. Clothes, possessions, and countless other things all required money after all. Listening to her surprisingly mature perspective, the Duke silently acknowledged to himself that she was an exceptionally clever little girl. Just then, someone knocked on the carriage window. It was Mal's. The moment Lyonia saw her, she happily announced that she liked Mal's very much. The Duke calmly agreed, explaining that Mal's was indeed an outstanding knight. Lyonia tilted her head in confusion before asking if she would eventually have her own knight to protect her too. The Duke explained that every proper daughter of House Vorioti required several attendants, including a personal tutor, a personal maid, and a personal guard. As for the position of her personal guard, Mal's was currently the strongest candidate. After a brief silence, the Duke suddenly asked Lyonia whether she had ever traveled through a portal before. She looked back at him with complete confusion and admitted that she did not even know what a portal was. The Duke patiently explained that a portal was a form of magical transportation that allowed people to instantly travel across enormous distances. He also mentioned that individuals unfamiliar with portals occasionally suffered from severe motion sickness, describing the experience as similar to passing through a strange tunnel. Lyonia listened carefully before confidently replying that she had never used one before, but she was sure it would probably be fine. Moments later, reality proved otherwise. The instant they emerged from the portal into the snow-covered north, Lyonia became violently ill. She doubled over and repeatedly threw up while Mal's quickly rushed to her side to support her. Watching the miserable little girl, the Duke quietly concluded that she was simply too physically weak. Between bouts of sickness, Lyonia weakly complained that he really was a mean mister. The Duke calmly pointed out that despite how unpleasant the experience had been, she was still alive. He had never once seen anyone die from motion sickness. Eventually, after she had exhausted herself, the Duke effortlessly picked her up and carried her through the snow. Feeling another wave of nausea coming, Lyonia weakly begged him not to pat her because she thought she might throw up again. The Duke remarked that she always seemed to have something to say. Lyonia looked up at him and mischievously asked whether she was allowed to throw up all over his clothes instead. Before he could respond, she grinned weakly and admitted that she was only joking. The Duke looked down at her and dryly commented that she really treated him as though he were nothing more than a toy for her own amusement. Completely exhausted from the journey, Lyonia slowly drifted off to sleep in his arms. The Duke quietly looked down at the peacefully sleeping child for a long moment before muttering to himself that she was still incredibly ugly. The Order of Gladigo, the elite protectors of the North, had faithfully served the Dukes of House Vorioti for many generations. They had stood beside the rulers of the frozen lands through countless battles, protecting the territory with unwavering loyalty. Their current lord was the infamous Duke Peliot Vorioti, a man who embodied the title of the Black Beast more than anyone else in the history of his family. His overwhelming presence, merciless reputation, and terrifying strength had earned him fear and respect throughout the empire. Yet that very same lord, whose name alone could make hardened warriors tremble, was currently carrying a small child in his arms. Mao's respectfully instructed everyone to make the necessary preparations so they could depart the moment the young lady was feeling better. The knights immediately acknowledged her order. Heavy snow continued to fall as the carriage made its way through the northern landscape. After sleeping peacefully for some time, Lyonia slowly opened her eyes while still resting comfortably in the Duke's arms. As the carriage continued forward, countless people gathered along the road, watching their lord return home. Lyonia curiously looked out the window, her eyes widening with amazement. She excitedly exclaimed that everything was incredible and admitted that she had never seen anything like it before. The Duke calmly remarked that, compared to the imperial capital, this place was actually rather small. Lyonia immediately protested, asking how she was supposed to know that when she had never even been to the capital before. To her, this was already the most magnificent place she had ever seen in her entire life. Pressing herself against the carriage window, she stared outside in fascination as endless blankets of snow stretched across the landscape. She happily pointed out just how much snow there was everywhere. The Duke explained that in the lands ruled by House Vorioti, the snow continued falling until spring arrived. Lyonia curiously asked whether it was always this cold. The Duke replied that once someone became accustomed to it, the cold no longer felt particularly harsh. Smiling brightly, Lyonia admitted that she liked the cold too. Meanwhile, back at the Vorioti estate, the servants and knights busily prepared for their lord's arrival. Everyone hurried into position while one of the attendants reminded the others that His Grace would be arriving at any moment and that they should make sure everything was ready. Before long, the grand carriage rolled through the castle gates and came to a stop. One of the servants respectfully stepped forward and welcomed the Duke home before opening the carriage door. The moment he looked inside, his eyes widened in complete astonishment at the unexpected sight of a small child accompanying His Grace. Before anyone could react, Lyonia enthusiastically leaned forward and shouted that everything was so amazing. She excitedly looked around and declared that the house was absolutely enormous. The Duke calmly lifted her into his arms before stepping out of the carriage. Instantly, every knight, maid, servant, and attendant bowed deeply in perfect unison as they respectfully welcomed their lord home. Feeling slightly embarrassed by all the attention, Lyonia shifted uncomfortably while still being carried. She quietly informed the Duke that she was feeling much better now and could walk by herself. The Duke simply replied that he already knew. As everyone remained bowed, countless thoughts raced through their minds. No one could understand who this mysterious little girl was or why the Duke himself was carrying her so naturally. While they continued to stare in disbelief, Lyonia tugged lightly at the Duke's clothes and innocently announced that she was hungry. The Duke calmly told her to wait just a little longer. Hearing her repeatedly call the Duke Mr. instead of addressing him formally left the servants even more confused than before. As they continued walking through the entrance hall, Lyonia casually placed a hand against the Duke's chest before innocently commenting that he had a very firm chest. The maids nearby could only stare in complete shock, unable to believe that anyone would dare touch the feared black beast so casually. Once inside, Lyonia's eyes wandered across the enormous castle. Every hallway, staircase, and towering ceiling filled her with wonder. She looked around in amazement before cheerfully declaring that the place looked exactly like those giant mansions where mysterious murders always happened. With complete seriousness, she dramatically announced that the culprit was surely among them. Without changing his expression, the Duke calmly asked how she had figured that out. Lyonia instantly froze before nervously asking if someone had actually died there. Her imagination immediately ran wild, and she suspiciously narrowed her eyes at the Duke before asking if he was the culprit. The maid walking behind them nearly lost her composure after hearing such an outrageous question directed at His Grace. Completely unfazed, the Duke casually informed Lyonia that there was a prison cell in the basement and asked whether she wanted to see it. After thinking for a brief moment, Lyonia wrinkled her nose and replied that a place like that probably had bugs, so she would rather not. Their conversation was interrupted when the elderly butler respectfully stepped forward to greet the Duke. He welcomed His Grace home and sincerely thanked him for allowing everyone to safely manage the estate during his absence. The Duke acknowledged his efforts before immediately giving another order. He instructed the butler, Kara, to summon the finest tailors and the most skilled craftsmen they could find. Slightly puzzled, Kara respectfully asked why His Grace suddenly required such services. The Duke calmly answered that the estate, in its current state, was simply not suitable for raising a child. Hearing those words left everyone standing nearby utterly stunned. A child? Before anyone could ask further questions, Lyonia happily introduced herself by saying that her name was Lyonia. The Duke immediately corrected her, pointing out that he distinctly remembered giving her a much longer name than that. Lyonia hesitated before shyly asking if she was really allowed to say the full name. The Duke questioned whether she intended to keep introducing herself using only her first name forever. She quietly shook her head. Blushing slightly from embarrassment, she gathered her courage before proudly introducing herself once again, this time saying her full name. "My name is Lyonia Vorioti." The moment those words left her mouth, the Duke gently patted her head in approval. Witnessing such an affectionate gesture from the infamous Black Beast left every servant completely speechless. The sight itself was undeniably heartwarming, yet it was so unbelievably strange that none of them could quite believe what they were seeing. After recovering from the shock, Kara respectfully announced that he would immediately arrange a proper meal for the young lady. Deep down, everyone realized that life at the Vorioti estate was about to become far more hectic than it had ever been before. Inside the castle kitchen, the servants gathered together while excitedly whispering among themselves about the unbelievable scene they had witnessed earlier. One servant confidently insisted that he was telling the truth because His Grace had genuinely returned with a child. Not only that, but the Duke had carried her in his arms the entire time without showing even the slightest sign of annoyance. Another servant immediately pointed out something even more surprising. The little girl had black hair. Hearing that detail sent the room into another wave of speculation. Someone cautiously wondered if the Duke had actually been involved with a woman after all. Another servant quickly replied that there must have been someone. After all, just look at His Grace's face. A man that handsome surely could not have remained alone forever. Someone else immediately argued that although the Duke was undeniably handsome, he was also terrifying enough to frighten almost anyone away. Another servant recalled that the young lady had not appeared frightened of him in the slightest. In fact, she had spoken to him so naturally that it almost seemed as though they had known each other for years. Before the conversation could continue any further, the kitchen doors suddenly burst open. Lyonia cheerfully walked inside alongside an assistant maid and enthusiastically introduced herself with a bright smile, proudly announcing that her name was Lyonia Vorioti. The servants instantly fell silent before several of them quietly admired just how unbelievably adorable she was. At that moment, the butler called for Connie, one of the assistant maids. She immediately stepped forward and respectfully answered his summons. The butler reminded her that she had been assigned to personally attend to the young lady. Connie politely confirmed that she understood her responsibilities. The butler then explained that Lady Lyonia had endured many hardships in her short life and instructed Connie to serve her with the greatest possible care and consideration. As Connie observed the child more closely, she quietly noticed just how incredibly thin she was. Yet despite her frail appearance, Lyonia's large round eyes remained bright, lively, and filled with innocent curiosity. Connie could not help smiling as she thought that all children were naturally adorable. Even so, a question quietly lingered in her mind. Could Lady Lyonia actually be His Grace's daughter? Elsewhere inside the estate, the Duke calmly sat at his desk reviewing documents while writing something. The butler soon entered the room with a troubled expression before respectfully asking His Grace exactly what he had been thinking. Was this truly the reason he had adopted a child? In the butler's opinion, the entire decision had been unbelievably impulsive and irresponsible. He questioned whether the Duke had even considered how much emotional pain the child could suffer because of such a sudden decision. The Duke silently ignored the lecture and simply glanced out the window. Outside, Lyonia happily played in the snow, laughing freely while her cheeks turned slightly pink from the cold. Watching her carefree smile, the Duke remained completely uninterested in everything the butler continued saying. The butler passionately argued that a child was not a pet. To him, the Duke's behavior resembled someone who had randomly picked up a stray dog or cat from the street simply to entertain themselves for a while. The Duke finally responded by asking whether the butler truly believed he did not understand the difference. The butler calmly answered that perhaps His Grace did understand, but then questioned why else he would suddenly bring home a child based on nothing more than a momentary impulse. The two men silently stared at one another, neither willing to back down. After a long pause, the butler asked the question that had been on everyone's mind since the Duke's return. He wanted to know whether Lady Lyonia was actually related to His Grace by blood. One of the men standing nearby immediately tried to ease the growing tension before the atmosphere became even more uncomfortable. The Duke's expression instantly turned cold as he warned them never to ask him the same question twice. The butler respectfully lowered his head but continued explaining the reason for his concern. Black hair was an extremely rare trait that only members of House Vorioti were known to possess. Now the Duke had suddenly adopted a little girl with black hair. Naturally, people throughout the empire would begin creating all sorts of rumors. Many would undoubtedly assume that she was His Grace's illegitimate daughter. Without showing the slightest concern, the Duke simply instructed the butler to focus on helping Lyonia gain some weight instead of constantly bothering him with pointless comments. The butler sighed deeply before admitting that he still could not understand what His Grace had truly been thinking. The Duke calmly replied that he intended to raise her properly. As far as he was concerned, that alone settled the matter. Hearing those words caused the butler to quietly reflect on the Duke's behavior. Despite his cold personality, His Grace genuinely appeared to care about the little girl. Perhaps there was no reason to worry after all. Returning to more practical matters, the butler explained that he would personally silence any servants who had become overly excited by the Duke's sudden decision. However, because famous craftsmen and tailors had already been summoned to the estate to prepare everything Lady Lyonia would need, rumors had almost certainly begun spreading throughout the entire northern province. He respectfully asked how His Grace intended to deal with those rumors. Once again, the Duke ignored the concern and simply looked outside, where Lyonia continued running through the snow as though she had lived there her entire life. Watching her so comfortably treating the estate as her own home, he quietly remarked that they should simply leave things as they were for now. The butler attempted to speak again, but before he could continue, the Duke shifted his gaze toward Mel's. Understanding the silent command, she respectfully stepped forward and carefully pointed out that unpleasant stories would almost certainly begin circulating behind His Grace's back. Some people might even claim that Lady Lyonia was nothing more than a temporary amusement who would eventually be discarded. The Duke answered with complete indifference. It was very simple. Anyone foolish enough to spread such rumors clearly possessed a death wish. In that case, they might as well finish the job properly and simply kill them. The room instantly fell silent. The Duke continued speaking in the same calm voice, instructing Mal's that if anyone making such remarks ever came to her attention, she had his full permission to stain her sword with their blood. Just then, a knock echoed through the room. A knight respectfully announced himself before requesting permission to enter. The Duke granted it. Entering the room, the knight, Manus, respectfully informed His Grace that everyone had been brought exactly as ordered. Upon hearing those words, the Duke slowly rose from his seat. A cold smile appeared on his face as he remarked that the guests he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Oh no, my lady. Please allow us to open it for you." The servants hurried forward the moment Lyonia reached the large doors. She immediately puffed out her cheeks and loudly insisted that she could open them herself. The servants exchanged helpless smiles before stepping aside and welcoming her inside. They warmly asked whether she had enjoyed herself. Lyonia's face instantly lit up with excitement as she enthusiastically explained that she had. The snow had reached all the way up to her ankles, and every single time she took a step, it felt as though the snow was clinging tightly to her feet and refusing to let go. One of the servants kindly asked if she would like them to have the pathways cleared. Lyonia quickly shook her head and refused, excitedly declaring that she loved the snow. She even announced that next time she was going to build a giant snowman. Seeing how much fun she had, the servant smiled warmly before suggesting that she enjoy a snack after playing outside. The chef proudly presented his specialty, freshly baked focaccia. Lyonia's eyes widened with amazement the moment she saw it. She happily thanked him before eagerly taking a bite. The moment the bread touched her tongue, her entire face brightened with delight. She excitedly declared that it was unbelievably delicious while happily munching away. The chef watched with a satisfied smile and encouraged her to eat as much as she wanted. Just then, Mal's entered the room and greeted the young lady. She asked whether Lady Lyonia had enjoyed exploring the estate. Lyonia immediately nodded and happily replied that she had enjoyed it very much. Mal's then gently reminded her that she did not need to address her so formally. Lyonia hesitated before explaining that using honorifics simply felt more comfortable to her. Mal smiled softly before telling her that it would be unheard of for the daughter of Duke Vorioti to speak so respectfully to an ordinary knight. Lyonia looked at her with complete sincerity and replied that Mal's had worked incredibly hard to become a knight, so she deserved to be respected. Touched by the innocent words, Mal's gently kissed the back of Lyonia's hand before informing her that His Grace was looking for her. Lyonia tilted her head and curiously asked if the Duke wanted her to do another cute thing. Miles could not help smiling as she admitted that it seemed the young lady had enjoyed doing those cute things too. As they walked through the estate together, Leonia suddenly stopped in her tracks. In front of her stood a beautifully crafted wooden rocking horse. She stared at it in complete surprise before asking why the Duke kept showing off how much money he had. Standing behind them, several assistants quietly whispered among themselves that the two of them really were alike. Like father, like daughter. They were both equally blunt and surprisingly similar. Hearing their comments, Miles quietly wondered how it was possible for both of them to be so brusque. Before long, Leonia arrived before the Duke. Looking at the expensive gift, she simply told him that he had gone completely overboard and should have accepted a simple thank you instead. The Duke calmly informed her that the gift came with one condition. Every single day, she would have to do one cute thing. Leonia immediately looked at him with complete disgust and asked what would happen if she refused. The Duke calmly answered that if she refused, then it would simply mean he had failed to raise his child properly. Even so, he assured her that he would never send her away just because she chose not to do it. Leonia stared at him in disbelief before muttering that he was unbelievably weird. Ignoring the insult, the Duke gently poked her forehead before asking when she planned to start calling him Dad. Leonia awkwardly scratched her cheek and admitted that she would at least try. She quickly added that she was not saying she had actually enjoyed any of this, although she was not entirely sure herself. The Duke then quietly held out his hand. Confused, Leonia asked why he wanted her hand. Instead of answering, the Duke placed a strawberry milk candy into her palm. He calmly explained that it was her reward. Every time she did something cute, she would receive another piece of candy. Watching the exchange, Miles could not hide her astonishment. His Grace was actually carrying strawberry milk sweets with him. That alone was almost harder to believe than anything else that had happened since Leonia arrived. While holding the candy, Leonia quietly asked Miles why the Duke had wanted to see her in the first place. She wondered whether he was angry about something. Miles gently explained that it was because they had some unpleasant visitors. Confused, Leonia asked why they were considered bad visitors. Miles softly answered that they were the very people who had hurt her back at the orphanage. She admitted that His Grace had instructed her to bring Lady Leonia there, but she was honestly worried. Seeing those people again might reopen painful memories and hurt her all over again. If Lady Leonia did not wish to see them, Miles would gladly escort her back to her room instead. She promised that she would personally explain everything to His Grace. Elsewhere, the Duke calmly continued reviewing reports while asking for an update regarding the orphanage. One of his subordinates respectfully informed him that the orphanage had been destroyed by what had officially been reported as an accidental fire. The local province had been notified that everyone inside had perished in the blaze, even though those responsible were still very much alive. Meanwhile, every innocent child and the pitiful victims had already been secretly relocated to a safe place. The report continued by stating that it was truly unfortunate about the children and the kind Miss Connier. According to the official story, had they survived the fire, they would have been brought to House Vorioti. The Duke quietly acknowledged the report before remarking that if only they had arrived a little earlier, perhaps every single one of them could have been saved without resorting to such measures. As those thoughts crossed his mind, his expression gradually darkened with restrained anger. Before him, kneeling on the floor with terrified expressions, were the orphanage director and every person who had participated in abusing the children. Just then, the silence inside the room was broken by a familiar voice calling out, "Mr." The members of House Vorioti had always stood above everyone else, even above the imperial family itself. There were countless reasons why their name commanded such overwhelming authority throughout the empire, but one reason in particular surpassed all the others. It was the fangs of the beast. Aura was a power that could only be attained after countless years of relentless training, pushing one's body beyond its limits until the warrior themselves became a living weapon. Mana, on the other hand, was the source from which all magic was born, the energy that every mage relied upon. Yet the power possessed by the Vorioti bloodline was something entirely different from either of those. It was a terrifying force that few could even comprehend. As the former orphanage staff knelt on the cold floor, every one of them trembled uncontrollably beneath the suffocating pressure filling the room. Before they could gather themselves, the heavy silence was suddenly broken by a familiar voice. "Mr. Leonia called out as she happily ran toward the Duke with all the strength her little legs could muster. The Duke immediately warned her that she was going to hurt herself if she kept running like that. Leonia simply looked up at him with a puzzled expression and asked what was wrong. She proudly explained that running away had been the one thing she had become truly good at while living in the orphanage. The Duke calmly remarked that she would probably only come to her senses after breaking her nose and seeing blood. Leonia frowned at him before asking why everything he said always sounded so extreme. After a brief pause, the Duke quietly observed that she must have had plenty of reasons to become so good at running away from the orphanage. Leonia casually admitted that it was true. Those people had used every opportunity they could find to beat her, so escaping had become second nature. At that moment, Lippert stepped forward with a gentle smile. Leonia immediately recognized him and happily greeted him as the secretary. Lippert politely corrected her, asking that she simply call him Lippert. He warmly told her that he was genuinely pleased to see that she appeared to be doing so much better than the last time they had met. Leonia smiled brightly and proudly announced that she was eating properly now and doing very well. Lippert sincerely replied that he was very happy to hear that. Suddenly, desperate voices echoed through the room. "Nia! Nia! Nia! It is us, your teachers." They called out to her one after another with exaggerated concern. They claimed they had been so worried about her safety and thanked the heavens that she was alive. One insisted that nobody had ever cared for her more than they had. Another asked why she had never sent them any letters after leaving. Someone else pretended to worry about whether she had been eating properly before falsely complimenting her appearance, claiming she had become so pretty that they barely recognized her. Finally, the orphanage director stepped forward with a pitiful smile. He reminded her that he was the director of the orphanage and claimed he still vividly remembered the day she had first arrived. According to him, it had been a blazing hot summer day. She had been as tiny and delicate as a little mouse, and he proudly declared that he had even been the one who had given her the name Nia. The Duke calmly looked toward Leonia before informing her that these visitors had specifically asked to see her. As her father, he explained that he had an obligation to receive them properly. That was precisely why he wanted her to meet them first, so that he could decide how they should be treated afterward. Leonia looked up at him in confusion and quietly asked why. The Duke answered that he wanted to know whether there was anyone among them whom she wished to spare. For a brief moment, Leonia simply stared at the people kneeling before her. Then her expression hardened completely. She coldly asked why she should forgive any of them. They were nothing but shameless liars who were completely full of it. Smiling in a way that sent chills through the room, she cheerfully declared that it was finally time for their torture. Almost as though she were happily introducing performers at a festival, she began pointing at each of them one by one while dancing around the room. She pointed at one teacher and explained that this was the woman who constantly pinched her arms until they bruised. Then she pointed at another teacher and revealed that this one loved boasting about beating children with a leather belt. She pointed toward another and explained that this teacher had stolen money from the orphanage to secretly go on dates with married women. Looking directly at the orphanage director, she mockingly asked whether he could see where he had ended up now. If only he had behaved like a decent human being, none of this would have happened. As every one of them shook in terror, Leonia slowly walked toward the director. She reminded him that, out of everyone there, the two of them shared the most memories together, did they not? Her voice gradually lost all traces of childish innocence as she demanded to know why he had tormented them so relentlessly. He and the teachers had been the very people entrusted with protecting the children, yet instead they had become the ones who caused them the greatest suffering. She asked him why he had chosen to live such a miserable and despicable life before shouting at him to answer her. Throughout the entire exchange, the Duke silently watched everything unfold without interrupting. Then, almost as an afterthought, Leonia calmly corrected one final lie. She pointed out that she had not arrived at the orphanage during the summer at all. It had actually been winter. She remarked that it really was not that difficult to remember something so simple. As soon as she finished speaking, she removed one of her shoes and casually dropped it onto the orphanage director's head. The room fell silent. Folding his arms across his chest, the Duke looked at the shoe before calmly asking what exactly that was supposed to be. Without the slightest hesitation, Leonia smiled sweetly and answered that it was a present for the visitors. A requiem. Lippert stood quietly, unable to hide the shock written across his face. She really was not his Grace's biological daughter? Before he could dwell on the thought any longer, the butler sharply called out to him, bringing his attention back to the present. Even so, Lippert could not stop thinking. Her black hair, her black eyes, and even that fierce temper were all so strikingly similar to the Duke's that it was difficult to believe there was no blood relation between them. Meanwhile, Leonia stood before the orphanage director with an expression that was completely devoid of sympathy. She coldly declared that he was not going anywhere. Looking him straight in the eyes, she admitted that merely having met him filled her with disgust. She sincerely hoped they would never cross paths again in this lifetime before telling him to go straight to hell. The moment those words left her mouth, she let out a deep breath and happily admitted that it felt wonderful. It was as though 10 years of indigestion had finally disappeared all at once. The Duke looked down at her and calmly pointed out that she was only 7 years old. Leonia immediately protested, explaining that it was simply a figure of speech. She even asked if he did not know his idioms. Without another word, the Duke reached into his pocket and placed a strawberry milk candy into her hand. Leonia stared at it in confusion before reminding him that she had not done anything cute that day. The Duke calmly corrected her and assured her that she certainly had. Still confused, Leonia asked whether he meant the part where she tormented the orphanage staff. The Duke replied that she had acted exactly like a true member of House Vorioti. Hearing those words caused Leonia's cheeks to flush a soft shade of pink. As the Duke gently patted her head, the maids and servants watching nearby suddenly burst into applause. Many of them excitedly praised the young lady, declaring that she was absolutely amazing. Others became so emotional that they could hardly contain themselves. Watching everyone around him react so enthusiastically, Lippert silently wondered whether he was the only person who was not moved by the scene. Perhaps he was the strange one after all. As the Duke effortlessly carried Leonia in his arms once again, she suddenly reminded him that he was not allowed to kill those people immediately. The Duke calmly assured her that he would never waste such valuable entertainment. Leonia immediately agreed, saying that they needed to get their money's worth first. The Duke looked at her with slight curiosity before asking exactly where she had learned to say things like that. Without hesitation, Leonia answered that she had learned it at the orphanage. A moment later, her eyes sparkled with excitement as another idea came to mind. She enthusiastically suggested tying ropes around all of them before pushing them off a cliff. They would fall all the way down, then the ropes would send them flying back upward, only for them to fall again, bounce back again, and continue repeating the process over and over. Once they finally stopped moving, they could simply leave them hanging there until the ropes eventually snapped. She laughed cheerfully while describing the entire plan as though it were the most entertaining game imaginable. The Duke quietly considered her proposal before remarking that it was certainly worth trying. As it happened, there was a perfectly suitable cliff located just behind the Vorioti estate. Leonia quickly added that they should not go overboard, however. If they wanted to torture them for a long time, they needed to make sure the prisoners stayed healthy enough to survive. Then she playfully warned the Duke that if he broke his promise, she would give him a noogie. Listening to the bizarre conversation between the two of them, Lippert suddenly found himself recalling an old memory. Wait a second. Could it really be possible that Regina was no longer? The thought refused to leave his mind. At almost the same time, both Lippert and the butler quietly remembered the same woman. Did Leonia not remind them of Lady Regina? Yet another possibility also crossed their minds. Perhaps the explanation with the highest chance of being true was that Leonia was actually the Duke's illegitimate daughter. The day they had first met her, the little girl had behaved no differently than an ordinary street orphan. Back then, Lippert had not seen even the slightest resemblance to Lady Regina. But now everything was different. Anyone looking at Leonia could clearly see that she had become the beloved young lady of House Vorioti, just as Lady Regina herself once had been. Even so, something still did not quite fit. Quietly, Lippert admitted to himself that Leonia did not actually resemble Lady Regina physically. Lady Regina had died long ago. The memory remained painfully vivid. On that dreadful day, heavy rain had poured endlessly over the lands of Vorioti. Lady Regina had been grasping the hand of the man she loved as they attempted to escape together. Lippert still remembered watching their carriage being swept away by the raging river until it disappeared into the distant currents. It was a sight he could never forget. And yet, despite an extensive search, no bodies had ever been recovered. A troubling possibility slowly formed in his mind. What if they had survived that accident? What if Lady Regina had successfully escaped from the lands of Vorioti? Elsewhere, completely unaware of the thoughts weighing on the adults around her, Leonia happily smiled as another strawberry milk candy was added to the growing collection inside her precious candy jar. As the Duke relaxed in his bath, his mind drifted back to the butler's earlier words. A child is not a pet. The sentence lingered in his thoughts as he quietly reflected on it. After finishing his bath and stepping out of the water, he could not help muttering to himself. How could anyone possibly mistake her for a pet? That would be an insult to a beast. Yet another thought soon surfaced in his mind. How did a little girl like Leonia even know the meaning of the word requiem? He vividly recalled her confidently using the word while speaking about the orphanage staff. Embezzlement. Requiem. Those were not expressions noble children of her age commonly used, let alone an orphan. She had only been 5 years old when she first arrived at the orphanage. Perhaps her life before that should be investigated. Or perhaps she was simply a prodigy. His expression gradually became more serious as he considered the possibilities. Just then, Lippert entered the room. The Duke looked at him with a calm but unmistakably displeased expression before reminding him that he had never given permission for anyone to come inside. Lippert respectfully apologized and explained that there was something important he believed His Grace needed to hear immediately. The Duke casually picked up a drink and took a sip before dryly remarking that Lippert was certainly quite a sight to behold standing there so stiffly. Looking rather tired himself, Lippert once again apologized for entering without permission but insisted that the matter concerned Lady Leonia and could not wait. The Duke quietly placed his drink back down on the table. Before Lippert could continue, a gentle knock echoed from outside the room. Leonia's cheerful voice could be heard from the hallway as she called out, asking whether Mr. was inside or not. Standing beside her, one of the maids politely explained that His Grace was probably still bathing. She had seen people preparing the bath earlier and suggested that perhaps they should come back later instead. Leonia shook her head and firmly replied that she would simply wait. After a brief silence, she curiously asked the maid whether she was afraid of Mr. The maid gave an awkward smile before explaining that His Grace was Duke Vorioti, the ruler of the northern lands and one of the most powerful people in the entire empire. Of course she was afraid. She was nothing more than an ordinary maid. Leonia looked up at her and innocently replied that Mr. had always been good to her. Smiling warmly, the maid explained that it was because His Grace cared for Lady Leonia very deeply. Leonia quietly admitted that she hoped that was true. Even so, she was beginning to worry that Mr. might remain an old bachelor forever because of her. The maid immediately reassured her, explaining that His Grace was an incredibly popular man. He possessed handsome looks, extraordinary status, immense strength, and everything a person could possibly want. Leonia immediately interrupted, insisting that Mr. also had the dirtiest temper imaginable. Sitting inside the room, Lippert silently listened to the entire conversation. He desperately wished he could burst into laughter, but he was equally certain that doing so would probably cost him his life. Outside, Leonia continued thinking out loud. She wondered if she would eventually have to take care of Mr. when he became old. If he remained so ill-tempered and never had children of his own, who else would look after him? Hearing those innocent worries caused the Duke to quietly set his drink down before walking toward the door. The moment he opened it, both Leonia and the maid froze in complete surprise. Embarrassed, Leonia quickly stammered that he had been inside all along. Why had he pretended not to be there? Before she could finish speaking, her face suddenly turned bright red as she realized the Duke had only just stepped out of his bath. She immediately exclaimed, asking why Mr. was standing there without any clothes. At that exact moment, Lippert was still sitting calmly on the sofa holding his drink. The unfortunate timing made the entire situation look far worse than it actually was. Flustered, Lippert hurriedly tried to explain that it was not what she thought. The Duke also calmly repeated that it was not what she was imagining. Leonia blinked a few times before innocently asking if that was really how they saw themselves. She then casually added that it was not a crime to be gay. Both men fell completely silent. Before either of them could respond, Leonia continued by saying that even if someone was a grumpy old man, that was no excuse to be old-fashioned. The Duke let out a quiet sigh before asking whether she genuinely believed his popularity would disappear simply because he had adopted a child. Leonia looked away for a moment before softly insisting that he should still meet a nice person someday. Curious, the Duke asked why she believed it should not happen now. Leonia hesitated before wondering if it was because of her. The Duke calmly answered that it had nothing to do with her. There simply was not anyone he liked. As the words left his mouth, he found himself wondering why he was having such a strange conversation with a 7-year-old child. The Duke then reached down to pick Leonia up. She became excited the moment he lifted her into his arms. As he began putting on his robe, Leonia looked at him with visible disappointment and asked why he was suddenly getting dressed. The Duke stared at her in disbelief before asking why she thought he would not. Leonia innocently replied that it was not as though looking at him hurt anyone. The Duke slowly closed his eyes and wondered what his life had become. Somehow, he was now being shamelessly harassed by his own daughter. Realizing she had embarrassed him, Lyonia quickly apologized and promised that from now on she would only secretly look instead. The Duke immediately questioned why that somehow sounded even worse. Deciding to change the subject, he asked why she had come to see him in the first place. Lyonia suddenly remembered and happily held out a small bundle. She explained that she had baked cookies together with the head chef because she thought he might be tired after working so hard torturing the people locked up in the basement prison. Since he was always giving her strawberry milk candies, she wanted to return the favor by giving him cookies for energy. The Duke quietly pointed out that every single ingredient used to bake those cookies had actually been purchased with his own money. Hearing that immediately annoyed Lyonia. She crossed her arms and complained that she hated it whenever he ruined moments like this. Pouting, she declared that if he did not want the cookies, then she simply would not give them to him anymore. The Duke immediately replied that he had never said he did not want them. Still pretending to be upset, Lyonia insisted that her feelings had been hurt and that she no longer wished to share them. The Duke dramatically sighed and wondered aloud how he was ever supposed to survive without receiving so many cookies. He then gently reminded her that her money was now his money anyway. Lyonia immediately smiled and admitted that she had only been joking. Standing quietly in the background, Lippert stared at the two of them in disbelief. Had they both completely forgotten that he was still standing there? As Lyonia happily skipped out of the room waving goodbye, the Duke finally noticed Lippert again. Looking at him with complete indifference, he casually asked why he was still there and what he wanted now. Lippert could only think to himself that his grace had actually forgotten about his existence. Clearing his throat, he explained that he had not even been given the opportunity to speak yet. The Duke calmly took another bite of the cookies and instructed him to get on with it then. Taking a deep breath, Lippert finally began. It was about Lady Lyonia. I hope Mr. liked the cookies. I am sure he did. You poured your whole heart into making them. Mal smiled warmly as she tucked Lyonia into bed. She gently remarked that today had been quite a chaotic day, had it not? She then softly asked if anything had made the young lady uncomfortable. Lyonia looked at her curiously, and Mal's admitted that she had been incredibly impressed by everything she had done earlier. Lyonia blinked in surprise and asked if she really meant that. Mal's nodded with complete sincerity before encouraging her to get plenty of rest. She pointed toward the small bell beside the bed and explained that if Lady Lyonia ever needed anything during the night, she only had to ring it. Curious, Lyonia immediately reached over and rang the bell. Mal smiled and explained that the bell had been enchanted with magic, allowing every employee in the estate to sense whenever it was used. She then held up the bracelet on her wrist and showed it to Lyonia, explaining that this was how she could sense the bell's magic. Lyonia stared at it with sparkling eyes and quietly whispered that it was fascinating. Mal's happily agreed, adding that the magical bracelet was also extremely expensive. After making sure everything was in place, she wished Lady Lyonia a good night and quietly left the room. As Lyonia lay in bed staring at the bell, something about it stirred a distant memory. She remembered seeing children performing with bells just like those during Christmas in her previous life. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the estate, Lippert continued the conversation with the Duke. He respectfully explained that the matter concerned Lady Lyonia's origins. The Duke calmly replied that he had believed this discussion had already ended. Lippert admitted that he still believed an investigation might be necessary. When the Duke asked him for his reasoning, Lippert cautiously requested one thing first. He begged his grace not to become angry until he had finished speaking. The Duke dryly remarked that it was a rather useless request. Lippert pleaded once more, insisting that he was genuinely risking his life by bringing up the subject. The Duke sarcastically asked whether Lippert expected him to make a pinky promise. Gathering his courage, Lippert finally spoke. He believed Lady Lyonia might somehow be connected to Lady Regina. The Duke immediately answered that Regina was dead. Lippert quietly acknowledged that fact before reminding him that Lady Regina's body had never actually been found. If Lady Regina and the man she loved had somehow survived while fleeing, and if Lady Lyonia happened to be their daughter, then perhaps they should put an end to the rumors claiming she was the Duke's illegitimate child. The Duke remained silent for a long moment before replying that he understood. He admitted that he had also considered investigating Lyonia's past. Lippert quietly expressed his relief, believing they shared the same opinion. However, the Duke calmly explained that Lippert's reasoning had actually convinced him to do the exact opposite. They had found Lyonia abandoned in an orphanage. Was that fact alone not enough? Lippert questioned whether they should not at least discover who her parents truly were. The Duke asked what purpose that would serve. Were they supposed to tell a little girl who had finally found happiness that her real parents had once been someone important but were now long dead? More importantly, the Duke pointed out that Lyonia would gain absolutely nothing from being known as Regina's daughter. If people were forced to give her a label, she would either become known as the daughter of a noblewoman who had run away with the man her family opposed, or as the illegitimate daughter of Duke Vorioti, the ruler of the north and one of the most powerful men in the empire. Between those two identities, the latter would offer her far greater protection and legitimacy. Lippert quietly lowered his head, admitting that he had been mistaken. He confessed that the Duke had once again managed to see much further than he had. As the conversation continued, another thought crossed the Duke's mind. Regina's daughter. He had not considered that possibility before. He then asked Lippert one final question. Looking at Lyonia honestly, did she truly resemble Lady Regina? After carefully considering the question, Lippert answered with complete honesty that she did not. In fact, she resembled His Grace to an almost frightening degree. He then explained that verifying the truth would actually be quite simple. When he had first found Lyonia at the orphanage, he had briefly noticed a faint glimmer of gold hidden within her black eyes. At the time, he had assumed it was merely stray mana leaking out unconsciously. But if that assumption had been wrong, then the quickest proof that she carried Vorioti blood would be the manifestation of the fangs of the beast. The following morning, the Duke and Lyonia sat together at the dining table enjoying breakfast. While they ate, the Duke called out to Lyonia and informed her that the dangling punishment they had discussed would have to wait until another day. Confused, Lyonia asked why. As she happily accepted another bite of food from his hand, the Duke explained that the weather had become far too cold. If they carried out the punishment now, even the innocent knights forced to supervise their troublesome guests might freeze to death. Lyonia pouted before muttering that they probably should have hung them up the day before instead. After finishing her meal, she hopped down from her chair. A nearby servant politely handed her her coat, and Lyonia happily thanked her before putting it on. Full of energy, she proudly declared that she was just like Superman. The Duke looked at her in confusion and asked who Superman was supposed to be. Lyonia enthusiastically explained that he was a hero who wore his underwear over his clothes. The Duke stared at her blankly before asking whether that simply made him a pervert. Lyonia quickly protested, insisting that he was not a pervert at all. Wearing his underwear over his clothes was simply his own personal style. The Duke remained unconvinced and calmly replied that it still sounded like the behavior of a pervert. Lyonia sighed dramatically and complained that Mr. always insisted on calling everyone a pervert, even though he was the strange one. She quickly added that Superman's outfit was not what made him special anyway. What really mattered was how strong he was, with his broad shoulders and impressive physique. Watching her enthusiastically ramble about fictional heroes, the Duke quietly wondered whether she simply had a habit of admiring strong people. Before long, Lyonia reached over and lightly poked the Duke's arm in fascination, commenting on how solid and firm he was. Smiling mischievously, she cheerfully called him Superman. The Duke calmly warned her that if she continued running around so carelessly, she was eventually going to break her nose. Still laughing, Lyonia followed beside him as the two of them continued walking together through the castle corridors. "Here is your book, my lady." "Thank you." Lyonia happily accepted the book before sitting beside the Duke with it resting comfortably in her lap. The Duke glanced at the cover before asking why she had not chosen a fairy tale instead. Lyonia looked up at him with a puzzled expression and replied that fairy tales were for childish children, and she had already read every single one of them. The Duke quietly admitted that such a thing was certainly possible. After a brief pause, he asked where she had even found a book like that. Lyonia casually explained that she had borrowed it from his library because he had told her she was free to read anything she wanted. Curious, the Duke asked why she had specifically chosen that particular book. Lyonia gently sighed before explaining that the title had simply resonated with her. From her own experience, she believed that life was ultimately all in vain. The unexpected answer caused the Duke to fall silent. Judging by the way she spoke, it sounded as though she had already experienced some kind of personal revolution despite being so young. Quietly, he concluded that life at the orphanage must have been far more difficult than he had imagined. After another moment of silence, the Duke softly asked whether she ever missed her real parents. Lyonia slowly lifted her head and looked at him. "Mister, I do not know who my real parents are." The Duke's eyes widened ever so slightly. Lyonia calmly continued, explaining that she remembered absolutely nothing from before arriving at the orphanage. As far as she was concerned, the Duke was her parent now. She had no memories of the people who had given birth to this body, so she had no feelings left to spare for people she could not even remember. The only people she truly missed were those who existed in the hidden part of her previous life, people she would never be able to meet again. Looking down at the book in her hands, she quietly asked whether she really had to remember. Without saying anything else, the Duke gently pulled her closer. He placed another strawberry milk candy into her hand before softly telling her that it was perfectly alright to remember. He then added that, at the very least, she had not forgotten that he was now her parent. The Duke admitted that he had begun wondering if she had forgotten because she always seemed as though she would rather do anything than call him dad. Leonia immediately protested, explaining that she simply was not used to saying it yet. The Duke calmly replied that she certainly had plenty of excuses. Leonia narrowed her eyes at him before asking whether he had a problem with that. As she unwrapped the strawberry milk candy and began eating it, the Duke suddenly called her name and asked her to look directly into his eyes. Leonia blinked in confusion before staring back at him. After several silent seconds, she tilted her head and asked whether they were having some sort of staring competition. The two of them continued silently looking into each other's eyes until the Duke finally spoke. He ordered every maid in the room to leave immediately. The servants respectfully bowed before quietly exiting, leaving only the Duke and Leonia behind. Once they were alone, the Duke looked directly at her and explained that he hated speaking in a roundabout manner. According to him, talking indirectly was nothing more than meaningless nonsense for fools who wanted to appear smarter than they really were. Listening to his unusually blunt opinion, Leonia quietly wondered whether he had once had a terrible experience with someone who constantly spoke in riddles. The Duke took a deep breath before deciding to be completely straightforward. He calmly told her that he believed she was actually his niece. Leonia's eyes widened in complete shock. She stared at him for several moments before asking how that could possibly be true. She reminded him that she was an orphan he had personally adopted from an orphanage. She honestly did not even know where she should begin correcting such an unbelievable statement. Remaining calm, the Duke explained that she possessed the defining traits of House Vorioti. At first, he had believed it might simply be an extraordinary coincidence. Black hair, however, was a characteristic that had only ever been inherited within the Vorioti bloodline. The day he first met her at the orphanage, fascinated by the fearless little girl standing before him, he had deliberately activated the fangs of the beast. At the time, he had assumed that the golden shimmer appearing within her eyes had merely been unconscious mana leaking from a young sorcerer instinctively protecting themselves. He now realized that assumption had been completely wrong. The Duke then asked Leonia whether she even knew what the fangs of the beast were. Leonia innocently answered that it was when his eyes changed color and became incredibly frightening. The Duke nodded before explaining that although she had not noticed it herself, her own eyes had shone with a golden light the moment she first saw him at the orphanage. They had resonated with his fangs. Leonia slowly recalled what had just happened between them. She quietly asked if that was the reason her eyes had glowed while they were staring at each other only moments ago. Was it because of that resonance? The Duke confirmed that it was. She then pointed out that she had not felt frightened this time. The Duke explained that it was because he had not intended to intimidate her. This time, he had only activated the ability to determine whether she possessed it herself. The fangs of the beast naturally responded to one another. Leonia lowered her gaze toward her own hands as countless thoughts flooded her mind. So, she really was a Vorioti. She looked down at herself in disbelief before grabbing her own cheek and stretching it as hard as she could. The sharp sting immediately made her realize that this was not a dream. Watching the strange display, the Duke dryly asked whether she had really needed to pull on her cheek with quite so much force. Still trying to process everything she had just learned, Leonia slowly lifted her head and quietly asked the question weighing most heavily on her heart. Then, who gave birth to me? The Duke remained silent for a brief moment before finally answering, my cousin. A faint look of complicated nostalgia crossed his face as he added that she had been the most troublesome and infuriating woman in the entire world. Peliot, Barya and the Black Beast. That was the title of the novel I had read in my previous life. It told the story of Duke Peliot Vorioti, the feared Lord of the North, and Lady Barya Irvinu, the woman who would eventually become his eternal spouse. Although it followed the familiar romance fantasy formula, the novel constantly broke away from the usual cliches in surprisingly interesting ways, making it one of the most memorable stories I had ever read. However, something completely unexpected happened. One day, I opened my eyes only to discover that I had not reincarnated as some noble lady with a luxurious life like the heroines in typical romance fantasy novels. Instead, I had become an orphan. Even now, it still felt impossible to believe. The moment I saw the black lion emblazoned upon the Vorioti coat of arms, I immediately realized that I had been transported into the world of that very novel. That realization was exactly why I had taken such an enormous gamble and risked my life at the orphanage. I believed that becoming the Duke's adopted daughter had to be at least 100 times better than spending another 10 miserable years trapped in that place. Even so, she recalled the moment the Duke had given her the name Lyonia Vorioti. Then she remembered the words he had spoken only a short while ago. "I think you are my niece." That revelation had been the last thing she ever expected. She quietly wondered whether being his niece was actually a good thing. As far as she could remember, none of this had ever been mentioned anywhere in the novel. More importantly, was it really normal for someone to reveal the secret of another person's birth immediately after an ordinary day spent eating, playing, and arguing over candy? Completely overwhelmed by the countless thoughts racing through her mind, Lyonia wandered through the estate. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice calling after her. "My goodness, one moment, my lady. You must not run like that or you are going to fall." Butler Kara hurried after her with visible concern. Remembering what the Duke had told her, Lyonia stopped and turned toward him. If she truly wanted answers, then perhaps Kara would know. She immediately asked him about the secret. Kara gently suggested that they sit down first before discussing such an important matter. Once they were seated, he calmly asked which secret she was referring to. Lyonia honestly replied that Mr. had told her about the person who had given birth to her. Hearing those words immediately changed Kara's expression. After a brief silence, he quietly asked what exactly his Grace had told her. Lyonia explained that the Duke had said his younger cousin was her mother. She then asked how he had been able to verify something so unbelievable. Kara calmly explained that it had been through the fangs of the beast. Lyonia innocently replied that she possessed the fangs too, and that the woman who had given birth to her had apparently possessed them as well. Before she could continue speaking, she suddenly noticed tears gathering in Kara's eyes. Looking at him with concern, she softly asked whether he was crying. Embarrassed, Kara quickly apologized for displaying such inappropriate behavior before quietly admitting that if Lady Regina truly had given birth to Lady Lyonia, then Lady Regina was almost certainly no longer among the living. As he gently wiped away his tears, Lyonia sincerely thanked him for worrying about her. Kara smiled warmly and assured her that it was nothing. After a brief pause, Lyonia carefully asked whether Mr. had hated the woman who had given birth to her. Kara immediately shook his head. Not at all. Lady Regina was simply Regina. Hearing her mother's name for the first time, Lyonia quietly repeated it to herself. So Regina was the name of the woman who had given birth to her. Kara continued explaining that although it might be inappropriate for a mere servant to speak so openly, he believed his Grace felt exactly the same way. Lady Regina had been an extraordinarily kind person. She always wore a gentle smile, never seemed burdened by worry, and possessed an innocent heart that sought nothing but peace and love wherever she went. Because of her warm personality, everyone who met her naturally came to love her. Listening to the description, Lyonia quietly concluded that Regina simply had absolutely no street smarts whatsoever. Kara smiled fondly as he continued reminiscing. Lady Regina had adored his Grace very much. Since neither of them had any brothers or sisters, she constantly tried to become his friend. She would ask him endless questions, beg him to play with her, and happily follow him wherever he went. She had always meant well and never once acted out of malice. Unfortunately, their personalities could not have been more different. Hearing the story, Lyonia silently wondered just how unbelievably clueless Regina must have been. Based on everything she had experienced in her previous life, she honestly believed there was nothing more exhausting than dealing with an endlessly innocent and clueless idealist. Another realization suddenly struck her. Regina had never once appeared anywhere in the novel. That probably revealed just how little importance she had held in Peliot's life. To him, his younger cousin had simply been someone who was always around. She had never become someone whose absence left a lasting impression. Thinking about that made Lyonia feel unexpectedly sorry for the woman she had never even met. Quietly, she asked Kara what had ultimately happened to Regina. Kara lowered his eyes before softly explaining that Lady Regina had run away from House Vorioti. The man she had fallen in love with had been a wandering knight with no permanent home. As everyone had expected, the Vorioti family strongly opposed their relationship. In the end, Lady Regina chose to turn her back on her family and leave the northern lands together with the man she loved. Listening to the story, Lyonia could not help thinking that perhaps she should never have become interested in asking about her past at all. A nameless wandering knight? To her, That sounded exactly like the sort of ridiculous title some worthless man would invent to make himself sound mysterious and impressive. If that were the title of a book, she was certain nobody would bother reading it, not even as a fairy tale. Seeing the thoughtful expression on her face, Kara gently asked whether Lady Lyonia, by any chance, missed Lady Regina. After remaining silent for a moment, Lyonia quietly thanked him for telling her everything. Then she softly admitted that perhaps this was one secret that would have been better left unasked. That night, as thick snow continued to fall outside, the Duke and Lyonia sat together in front of the crackling fireplace. The warm glow of the flames filled the room while the howling wind echoed faintly beyond the castle walls. After a long moment of comfortable silence, the Duke finally asked whether everything she had learned earlier had been enough to satisfy her curiosity about her parents. Lyonia quietly thought about the question before answering honestly. What was she supposed to do? Cling to people she could not even remember? She had no memories of them at all. She was not someone who remained attached to the past. Instead, she always chose to look forward. Hearing her answer, the Duke gently patted her head. Looking at her with quiet amusement, he remarked that in that regard, she resembled him far more than she resembled Regina. Lyonia's cheeks immediately turned slightly pink. She happily concluded that this meant she probably was not as unbelievably clueless as Regina had apparently been. After a brief pause, however, her expression softened. She admitted that there was one thing she still wanted. She wanted to visit Miss Connier and all of her friends again. The Duke calmly explained that they were currently staying safely at the orphanage established within the lands of House Vorioti. He assured her that once the weather cleared, he would personally take her there. Lyonia's eyes instantly sparkled with excitement. Really? You promise, mister? The Duke quietly nodded. Even so, Lyonia suddenly became concerned. She hesitantly asked whether he was really free to do something like that because she had not seen him working very much lately. The Duke casually replied that she should focus more on not spilling crumbs everywhere whenever she ate snacks. Lyonia looked down at herself before asking why he kept assuming she spilled things so often that she now had to wear an apron. She proudly explained that what she was wearing was not an apron at all. It was simply an apron dress, and it was part of her outfit. The Duke calmly reminded her that he had personally watched her spill food and drool while eating snacks earlier that very day. Lyonia immediately protested, insisting that it had only happened once. Just once. The Duke smugly replied that when he had been her age, he had never spilled anything while eating. Lyonia narrowed her eyes before asking whether this had somehow become a competition that he desperately wanted to win. Without missing a beat, the Duke answered that if she approached it with the right attitude, she should simply learn from the example of her incredible father. Lyonia looked at him skeptically before asking what exactly she was supposed to learn from him in the first place. Their playful conversation gradually shifted as the Duke casually mentioned that he would not be staying at the estate for much longer. Curious, Lyonia immediately asked why. The Duke explained that it was the season when monsters became especially active. Lyonia could not help pointing out that describing it as monsters fooling around sounded rather strange. The Duke calmly replied that she should be grateful she was not an ordinary child. Lyonia quickly fired back by saying that he should also be grateful he was not an ordinary father. Looking into the dancing flames of the fireplace, the Duke explained that the lands ruled by House Vorioti were home to countless monsters. Some people even referred to the Northern Territory as nothing more than a monster's lair. Once the blizzard settled, he would personally lead the knights on a large-scale monster hunt to reduce their numbers before they became a greater threat. Lyonia quietly stared at him as he spoke. After noticing her gaze lingering on him, the Duke casually told her to turn around. Continuing his explanation, he said that if the weather cleared while they were still hunting, they would likely finish much sooner. However, if another blizzard arrived halfway through the expedition, everything would take considerably longer because humans were far more affected by the harsh weather than the monsters themselves. Even so, he assured her once again that he would definitely take her to visit Miss Connier and the others. Then he unexpectedly added something else. Someday, he would also take her with him on one of those monster hunts. Lyonia blinked in surprise before asking why she had to go. The Duke answered with complete certainty. Because she was his heir. That was the very reason he had brought her to the north in the first place. Lyonia stared at him in disbelief before remarking that he really was far too careless with his own life. She then innocently asked whether he still intended to get married someday. The Duke calmly answered that, as it turned out, raising a child was much more entertaining than he had expected. Lyonia suddenly remembered something and suspiciously looked at him. She asked whether he and Lippert had secretly been discussing something important that day. The Duke immediately warned her that if she brought up that subject again, he would confiscate every last one of her snacks. Leonia instantly surrendered, laughing as she admitted that she had only been joking. At that moment, one of the maids entered the room carrying a tray filled with freshly baked biscuits and warm tea. Leonia politely thanked the maid for bringing them. Watching the exchange, the Duke pointed out that she always used honorifics when speaking to the servants. Leonia looked back at him and casually asked if there was something wrong with that. The Duke observed that despite treating every servant so politely, she remained remarkably blunt whenever she spoke to him. He wondered aloud what exactly was wrong with her. Leonia mischievously asked whether he actually wanted her to start speaking politely to him as well. The Duke immediately refused, saying that such a thing would be absolutely disgusting. Instead, he simply instructed her to slowly correct her habit of being overly formal with the employees. Leonia pouted before telling him not to rush her because these things took time. She confidently assured him that she would take care of everything eventually. After another moment of silence, she pointed toward the book lying nearby and politely asked if the servant could hand it to her. The Duke calmly picked up his teacup, took another sip, and flatly replied no. Then, with his usual serious expression, he added that money would take care of everything. As one of the servants respectfully handed Leonia the book, the Duke calmly made an announcement that immediately stunned everyone present. Beginning today, every employee of House Vorioti is dismissed. Leonia froze in complete disbelief before loudly asking what he meant and why he would suddenly do something so outrageous. The Duke answered as though it were the most reasonable decision imaginable. Mere employees had actually allowed a member of House Vorioti to use polite speech toward them. As the lord of the estate, he refused to stand by and watch discipline deteriorate any further. He even remarked that he could have ordered every one of their ears to be cut off, but out of sheer generosity, he had decided to dismiss them instead. He then ordered every servant to return to their rooms immediately, gather their belongings, and assemble in the main hall. Leonia instantly threw up her hands in frustration and shouted that he was unbelievably cheap. Fine. She would stop using honorifics altogether. She could not believe he would use every employee in the estate to blackmail her. In her opinion, he was even more monstrous than the monsters living outside the northern lands. Watching her surrender so quickly, the Duke calmly remarked that it had not taken very long at all. Leonia immediately protested, insisting that it had taken plenty of time. Looking at him with an irritated expression while absent-mindedly munching on biscuits, she continued glaring at him. The Duke simply pointed at her and reminded her that this was exactly what he had meant when he said money would solve everything. After allowing her a few more bites, he casually changed the subject and told her to stop lazing around because it was time for him to introduce her to the knights. Leonia immediately complained that there was far too much snow outside and reminded him that he had specifically instructed her to gain weight. That was exactly why she was refusing to move. The Duke sighed and remarked that she was full of excuses. From his perspective, she spent most of her time lying comfortably on the sofa anyway. Without waiting for another protest, he calmly walked over, effortlessly lifted her into his arms, and simply declared that it was time to go. As they made their way through the long castle corridors, Leonia quietly observed the man carrying her. He truly was Duke Vorioti, the feared ruler of the north. He possessed a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably terrifying, while his personality was one that absolutely nobody would ever describe as warm or good-natured. Looking at him, an uneasy thought suddenly crossed her mind. She softly asked what would happen if one day he simply decided to throw her out on a whim. The Duke immediately looked down at her and calmly asked who exactly she thought he was. The two quietly stared at one another before he answered with complete certainty. Leonia, you are my daughter. I will take responsibility for you until the very end. His unwavering response immediately eased the anxiety she had unknowingly been carrying. Smiling faintly, she admitted that she really disliked people who made fun of their own daughters. Just then, a strange sound echoed through the corridor. Leonia quickly looked upward before excitedly pointing toward the ceiling and asking what the enormous carving above them was. The Duke explained that one of the ancestors of House Vorioti had carved it long ago. Leonia stared at it for several moments before remarking that it seemed incredibly excessive. Looking at something that intimidating before going to sleep would probably make it difficult for anyone to rest peacefully. Then another question occurred to her. Why had they carved it so incredibly high up? The Duke explained that if it had been placed any lower, the powerful aura released during the carving process might have caused the roof itself to collapse. Curious, Lyonia asked what aura actually was. The Duke patiently explained that aura was an energy residing within certain people's bodies, acquired through relentless physical training until it became an extraordinary power. Unlike mana, which was an innate ability connected to magic and the mind, aura was something physical that had to be earned through effort. Even so, natural talent still played an important role, as training alone was rarely enough for someone to awaken it. He further explained that within the entire Order of Gladigo, there were only 3 knights capable of emitting aura. Impressed, Lyonia immediately asked whether he could use aura too. The Duke calmly shook his head before explaining that he had been born possessing something far more powerful than ordinary aura. Hearing that answer, Lyonia instantly realized what he meant. The fangs of the beast. A faint smile appeared on the Duke's face as he confirmed her guess. Lyonia pouted and complained that he really was an annoying person sometimes. The Duke then calmly informed her that the fangs of the beast also lay dormant within her. Someday, she too would have to learn how to control and use that extraordinary power. Once I have my fangs, I'm gonna bite you first, she says. Not if I bite you first, he replies. Your chest will be the first place I bite, she says. Why are you so obsessed with my chest? Hey dude, don't treat me like a pervert. She seems to have some self-awareness that she is a pervert. Listen closely, I like beefy bulging muscles. Got that? I like them beefy. Bulging, she shouts. Again and again and again, everyone hears it. As Lyonia's loud voice echoed throughout the castle, everyone nearby stopped what they were doing. The servants and knights exchanged bewildered glances, wondering if they had heard correctly. Bulging muscles? Did she really just shout that? Confused whispers quickly spread through the hallways as everyone began gossiping among themselves, trying to figure out where such a strange statement had come from. Some even jokingly wondered if a suspicious pervert had somehow wandered into the training grounds. Looking toward the source of the commotion, they quickly realized it was simply the Duke walking through the corridors with Lyonia in his arms. The moment they saw His Grace approaching, everyone immediately straightened their posture and respectfully bowed. My lord. The Duke calmly glanced toward one of the knights and casually remarked that Mono was already married. Lyonia looked at him in complete confusion before asking what the point of saying that was. Without changing his expression, the Duke replied that it meant Mono could not possibly be hers. Lyonia immediately puffed out her cheeks and complained that Mr. was really trying his hardest to get on her nerves today. The Duke calmly answered that he clearly had not succeeded yet because she was still breathing perfectly fine. Lyonia folded her arms and declared that instead of growing older, Mr. seemed to be growing younger every day. The Duke immediately responded that neither of those things had actually happened. Before the conversation could continue, a loud command echoed across the training grounds as the knights were ordered to assemble. Within moments, the members of the Order of Gladigo stood lined up in perfect formation. The moment Lyonia spotted Mal's among them, her face instantly lit up with excitement. She enthusiastically waved both of her hands and loudly praised everyone for their hard work, causing several of the knights to smile. The Duke stepped forward and announced that before they departed for the upcoming monster hunt, there was someone they all needed to meet. He introduced Lyonia as his daughter before turning toward her and introducing the knights in return. He explained that this was the Order of Gladigo, the elite force that stood beside him in protecting the northern lands. Stepping forward with perfect discipline, Mono Mels, the vice captain of the Order of Gladigo, respectfully greeted Lady Lyonia on behalf of every knight present. Lyonia politely introduced herself as Lyonia Vorioti before returning the greeting. The Duke then turned his attention back to Mels and calmly asked whether all the preparations for the monster hunt were proceeding smoothly. Mels respectfully reported that everything was progressing according to schedule. However, while His Grace had been away, several small villages had already been attacked by young monsters. Because of that, they anticipated this expedition would be considerably more dangerous than previous hunts. Younger monsters were especially aggressive, unpredictable, and far more sensitive than older ones. While the discussion continued, Lyonia's eyes suddenly widened with excitement. Tugging on the Duke's sleeve, she repeatedly called out to him before asking him to put her down. The Duke calmly instructed her to remain beside Mels instead. Confused, Lyonia asked why. Without hesitation, he replied that it would prevent her from bothering the knights too much. Offended by the remark, Lyonia immediately asked whether he honestly thought she was some kind of troublemaker. She then reminded him that he had been smiling earlier. Curious, she wanted to know why. The Duke calmly answered that she had clearly been thinking about running off to play with both the knights and the dames. Lyonia grinned from ear to ear before insisting that she intended to play with everyone equally. The moment her feet touched the ground, she happily ran over toward the gathered knights and greeted them with her usual boundless enthusiasm. Watching the cheerful scene unfold, several of the knights quietly remarked that Lady Lyonia looked far healthier than when they had first met her. They were relieved to see that she appeared to be adjusting to life in the north without any difficulty. The Duke calmly replied that this had always been her home. Another knight smiled and observed that simply having a child around the estate had completely changed the atmosphere. The castle felt much livelier than before, and everyone seemed noticeably happier. One of the knights respectfully asked whether His Grace had already added Lady Lyonia to the Vorioti family registry. Without hesitation, the Duke answered that it had already been done. Hearing that response, the gathered knights smiled with visible satisfaction before warmly greeting their young lady once more. They asked whether she had been doing well. Lyonia happily replied that she had been doing wonderfully thanks to everyone around her. Several knights remarked that she had become even prettier since arriving at the estate. Feeling slightly embarrassed by all the attention, Lyonia shyly asked whether she was bothering any of them. Every knight immediately denied it, assuring her that they were delighted she had come to House Vorioti and that meeting her was an honor. One of the knights then chuckled and admitted that they had overheard something rather interesting earlier. Apparently, Lady Lyonia liked muscles. Lyonia nodded enthusiastically and honestly admitted that she did indeed like seeing strong muscles. The knight laughed proudly before telling her that she had excellent taste. In his opinion, true physical beauty came from strength and disciplined training because muscles never betrayed the effort someone put into earning them. As he proudly flexed his arm with a smug grin, several of the other knights looked at him with tired expressions while Lyonia watched with sparkling eyes, thoroughly impressed. Quietly admiring the display, she began thinking that perhaps she needed to become stronger and build some muscles of her own someday. The knights had already heard two different stories about Lady Lyonia. The first was the undeniable truth that she had been adopted from an orphanage. The second was the completely baseless rumor claiming that she was actually the Duke's illegitimate daughter. Because she had arrived at the estate in such a frail and pitiful condition, every knight had secretly worried about her, although none of them allowed their concern to show openly. Now, however, as they watched her happily running around with a bright smile on her face, they could not help feeling relieved. It truly was comforting to see their young lady healthy, energetic, and laughing so freely. Then again, whether that smile could really be described as innocent was open to debate. After all, there surely could not be another 7-year-old in the entire empire who became this excited over seeing well-trained muscles. While Lyonia continued enthusiastically admiring the knights, the Duke quietly turned toward them and asked whether their own children had behaved like this at her age. The knights looked at one another in confusion before asking exactly what His Grace meant by like this. The Duke calmly explained that his daughter seemed completely obsessed with muscles. Several knights immediately laughed before explaining that children often became fascinated by things adults found rather strange. One knight fondly recalled that when his children had been 7, they had become obsessed with collecting colorful cookie wrappers. Another proudly shared that his daughter used to fill an entire treasure chest with ordinary stones she found outside because she believed every single one of them was precious. A different knight sighed before admitting that his eldest son had gone through a phase of collecting dead insects. One after another, they began sharing amusing stories about the little troubles and strange habits their own children had while growing up. For the very first time in his life, the Duke quietly listened to every one of their stories without interrupting. As he reflected on their experiences, he found himself thinking that it was rather strange. Somehow, he could actually understand how they felt now. One of the knights smiled before respectfully asking if His Grace had any questions about raising children now that he had become a father himself. After thinking for a moment, the Duke admitted that his child was simply too smart. The knights looked at him with puzzled expression. The Duke continued explaining that Lyonia casually used phrases such as embezzlement of funds despite only being 7 years old. She had already finished reading every fairy tale book he had purchased for her. In fact, she had somehow managed to read more than 50 books in less than a month, something he still found difficult to believe. She was completely different from every other child. Unlike the countless children who burst into tears the moment they saw him, Lyonia never showed the slightest fear. She constantly argued with him, picked fights with him, kicked him whenever she was annoyed, and somehow still remained the most diligent child he had ever met. She even baked cookies for him. The Duke quietly concluded that she possessed far too much talent for someone her age, and because of that, he needed to seriously consider what kind of future awaited her. The knights exchanged awkward glances before quietly agreeing. The Duke was not finished yet. He continued by saying that because she took after him, she had become even more beautiful now that she had started gaining weight. Simply being a member of House Vorioti would already earn her admiration and respect throughout the empire for the rest of her life. But with a face like hers, he genuinely could not imagine how many people would eventually fall at her feet. The knights stood there in complete silence. None of them had the slightest idea how they were supposed to respond to such a proud father. Meanwhile, not far away, Lyonia continued enjoying herself among the knights. She excitedly clapped her hands before asking them to do it again. Then she suggested that this time they should sing along while she performed. Several knights laughed and enthusiastically agreed, promising that they would provide the rhythm. Hearing that only made Lyonia even more excited. She immediately began chanting at the top of her lungs that muscles were the best. Hustle, muscle, double muscle. It was simply too wonderful. Then she reminded everyone not to forget the legs, especially the thighs, before proudly declaring it was time for a muscle wave. She energetically encouraged every knight around her until many of them found themselves joining in with laughter. Watching the bizarre spectacle unfold, the Duke could only stare in complete silence. One of the knights slowly turned toward him before quietly admitting that his own children had definitely never behaved like this. Another immediately agreed that neither had his. A third knight simply smiled before saying that Lady Lyonia was certainly someone special. After all, genuine prodigies often possessed unusual little quirks of their own. Laughter gradually spread throughout the training grounds. The following morning, Lyonia eagerly rushed to the window the moment she woke up. Her eyes widened with amazement as she looked outside. Snow had piled up everywhere. One of the maids greeted her with a warm good morning and remarked that she was awake unusually early. Lyonia happily returned the greeting before excitedly pointing outside. The snow had accumulated until it was nearly as tall as a person. She had never seen so much snow in her entire life. The maid smiled and gently explained that this winter actually had less snow than usual. Lyonia stared at her in complete disbelief. Less snow? It was already taller than a person. The maid laughed softly before telling her that during the previous winter, the snow had reached all the way up to the second-floor windows. Throughout winter, almost all daily activities inside the Vorioti estate took place only on the third floor and above because the lower floors became buried beneath the snow. Remembering the previous evening, Lyonia realized that she and the Duke had indeed been sitting in one of the third-floor drawing rooms. The maid then presented several outfits and politely asked which one Lady Lyonia wished to wear that day. Lyonia carefully looked over every dress before honestly admitting that they all looked beautiful, making it impossible for her to choose. Smiling, the maid selected one herself. A short while later, Lyonia excitedly ran off to find the Duke. The moment she saw him, she cheerfully greeted him and immediately began asking one question after another. Had he slept well? Did he have any pleasant dreams? Had he dreamed about her? The Duke calmly replied that dreaming about her certainly would not qualify as a pleasant dream. Lyonia instantly pouted and complained that he really did not have to be so mean. She then pointed out that he had not even bothered asking whether she had slept well. The Duke simply answered that he did not need to ask because he could already tell that she had slept perfectly fine. Curious, Lyonia stepped closer and sniffed him. She asked whether he had been training because he seemed slightly damp. Confused, the Duke asked what she meant. Lyonia explained that he smelled like fresh soap. Without another word, the Duke gently lifted her and sat her down on the table before changing the subject. He informed her that the departure date for the monster hunt had finally been decided. Lyonia immediately asked when they would be leaving. Tomorrow, the Duke answered. Her eyes widened in surprise. Tomorrow? Already? The Duke calmly explained that the departure had actually been delayed. Under normal circumstances, they would have left today. Hearing that made Lyonia quietly realize just how little time remained. The Duke then added that before he departed, he intended to introduce her to the tutors who would be responsible for her education. Lyonia blinked in confusion. Tutors? As the carriage slowly came to a stop inside the estate, two distinguished figures stepped out before respectfully bowing toward the Duke. The first to introduce herself was Karina Tedros. With graceful composure, she announced that she would be responsible for teaching Lady Lyonia proper etiquette. The moment Lyonia laid eyes on her, she could not help quietly admiring how beautiful she was. Soon afterward, the second guest stepped forward. He introduced himself as Ardea and explained that he would be teaching her history. Looking at his calm and somewhat sleepy expression, Lyonia silently thought that he looked incredibly tired all the time. Standing beside the Duke, she carefully observed both of her new tutors. The Duke calmly called her name, prompting Lyonia to politely bow before introducing herself. She greeted them respectfully and announced that her name was Lyonia Vorioti. Both tutors quietly observed the young lady before them. The Duke then explained that Countess Karina Tedros would visit the estate once every week to conduct her lessons, while Ardea would be residing at the Vorioti estate permanently throughout her education. After listening carefully, Lyonia curiously looked up at the Duke and asked whether there was anything she should be especially careful about while studying under them. The Duke looked down at her with his usual calm expression before asking why she believed she needed to be careful in the first place. According to him, if anyone had reason to be cautious, it was her tutors rather than herself. As the daughter of Duke Vorioti, there was almost nothing she needed to fear while she remained in the northern lands. Even if she happened to make a mistake, she would still be protected. Lyonia tilted her head before innocently asking whether that protection would extend even if she killed someone. The Duke admitted that her example was rather extreme, but calmly explained that something on the level of what she had done to the orphanage staff would certainly not become a problem. Lyonia quietly reflected that nothing truly surpassed the advantage of being born with power. The Duke responded that she really ought to be grateful to him. Without missing a beat, Lyonia fired back that he should be grateful she was patient enough to live together with him. The Duke simply ignored the remark. Changing the subject, Lyonia explained that before beginning her lessons, she wanted to know more about the people who would be teaching her. The Duke began by introducing Ardea in greater detail. He explained that Ardea was an exceptionally accomplished scholar, a member of the Imperial Institution, and formerly a professor at the Academy. The Imperial Institution was a prestigious research organization that only the greatest geniuses in the Empire were permitted to join. Through countless remarkable achievements, it had earned the reputation of being the third greatest influence in the Empire. Most of its members were graduates of the Academy, the largest and most prestigious educational institution located in the imperial capital. Hearing this, Lyonia became even more curious. If Ardea was truly such a remarkable person, why was he no longer teaching at the Academy? More importantly, why had someone of his caliber chosen to come all the way to the frozen north? After satisfying her curiosity about Ardea, she immediately turned her attention toward Countess Karina Tedros. Instead of answering immediately, the Duke casually handed Lyonia another strawberry milk candy before calmly explaining that Countess Karina had once pursued him because she had feelings for him. Lyonia nearly shouted in disbelief. "Mister, why would you ever hire someone like that?" After thinking about it for another moment, she became even more bewildered. Did that not make Countess Karina rather strange too? To Lyonia, the situation sounded exactly like one of those overly dramatic soap operas. She honestly found the entire thing unbelievably weird. The Duke calmly explained that despite everything, there was nobody in the Northern Territories capable of surpassing Countess Karina's mastery of etiquette. She also possessed an outstanding reputation within high society. Listening to him, Lyonia quietly noticed that he almost sounded as though he were making excuses on Karina's behalf. At the very least, she concluded that the Countess certainly was neither foolish nor clueless. Curious once again, Lyonia asked what exactly society in the capital was like. The Duke answered without the slightest hesitation. It was every bit as filthy as the noble parliament. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than an elegant gathering of refined noble ladies enjoying one another's company. In reality, however, it was a ruthless battlefield where hidden schemes, silent rivalries, and carefully calculated political games unfolded beneath smiling faces and polite conversation. He continued by explaining that while the Imperial Institution ranked as the third greatest influence in the Empire, the capital itself stood as the second. Sooner or later, Lyonia would inevitably have to go there. As a member of House Vorioti, it was simply a fate she could not avoid. Even so, the Duke quietly admitted that if he had the choice, he would rather never send her there at all. As he finished speaking, he turned around after hearing her voice. Lyonia was holding another strawberry milk candy out toward him with a bright smile. "Here!" The Duke looked at the candy before calmly replying that he had not been referring to that. Instead of answering, Lyonia reached forward, gently wrapped her small hand around his index finger, and softly suggested that they hold hands. The Duke quietly asked whether she truly wanted to. She shyly replied that perhaps she did. The two of them continued walking side by side through the snow-covered gardens. Because Lyonia's little steps were so much shorter than his own, she walked at an incredibly slow pace. Watching her carefully making her way through the snow, the Duke silently thought that she really was slow. Meanwhile, Lyonia quietly reflected on everything she had learned. That old lady still seemed rather suspicious to her, but regardless of her doubts, she made a promise. She would study diligently while the Duke was away, so he needed to come back home safely and quickly. Hearing those words, the Duke found himself thinking that perhaps this arrangement was not so bad after all. He then promised that once the monster hunt was over, he would personally take her to visit Miss Connier and all of her friends at the orphanage. Lyonia happily agreed. The Duke teasingly warned her not to cry because she missed him while he was gone. Lyonia confidently declared that she would never cry. The Duke looked down at her with quiet affection before asking whether she would at least miss him a little. After pretending to think about it for a moment, Lyonia finally admitted that perhaps she would miss him just a little. The Duke smiled faintly before remarking that she really was incapable of being honest. Lyonia immediately looked back at him and pointed out that he was hardly one to talk. On the day the monster hunt was scheduled to begin, the entire Vorioti estate was already bustling with activity before sunrise. Knights moved about making their final preparations while servants hurried to complete the last of the supplies. Despite the early hour, Lyonia forced herself out of bed. Still half asleep, she slowly walked outside, stretching her arms as wide as she could before letting out a long yawn. Watching her struggle to keep her eyes open, the Duke calmly asked why she had bothered getting up instead of sleeping a little longer. He even remarked that if she yawned any wider, her mouth was going to tear apart. Shivering from the freezing northern air, Lyonia rubbed her arms and complained that it was unbelievably cold. She explained that the only reason she had come outside at all was because Mr. was leaving. The Duke quietly told her to go back inside and get some more sleep instead of forcing herself to stay awake. Ignoring his suggestion, Lyonia suddenly held out a basket toward him and insisted that he take it with him. She jokingly accused him of discrimination as she pushed it into his hands. Looking inside, the Duke discovered that it was filled with freshly baked cookies. Slightly surprised, he asked when she had even managed to bake all of them. Lyonia proudly answered that she had secretly baked them during the night. She then reminded him that she was still his daughter, after all. As she watched him examine the basket, she recalled asking Lippert not long ago whether the Duke had liked the cookies she had previously made for him. Lippert had smiled and admitted that his Grace had eaten every single one without leaving even one behind for anyone else. He had clearly enjoyed them very much. Remembering that conversation, Lyonia happily explained that she had baked even more this time. She pointed toward one particular cookie marked with a small black line and told the Duke that one belonged specifically to him. All the remaining cookies were for the other knights to share during the journey. Looking up at him with genuine concern, she softly told him to stay safe. Then, after thinking for another moment, she added that he should remember to bring back plenty of tasty things when he returned home. The Duke quietly repeated the words tasty things to himself before giving a faint smile. Before long, Lyonia's exhaustion finally caught up with her. Standing there in the cold, she slowly drifted off to sleep. Malz gently lifted the sleeping child into her arms while the Duke looked at her peaceful face. Quietly brushing her hair back with one hand, he lovingly patted her head and remarked that when it came to sweetness, nothing in the world could ever compare to her. Even if something did, he would simply get rid of it. Looking toward everyone gathered before him, the Duke addressed the people of House Vorioti one final time before departing. While I am away, you are the lords of Vorioti. Take good care of this place. Then he looked at the sleeping Lyonia once more and softly reminded her to study hard, sleep early every night, and never skip any of her meals. Completely asleep, Lyonia responded only with gentle snores. The Duke sighed before adding one last remark, hoping that while he was away she would also moderate her unusual obsession with muscles. Looking toward Sir Gavir, he asked him to look after her. Gavir immediately stepped forward and solemnly vowed that he would protect Lady Lyonia with his very life. Even after everything was ready, the Duke found himself reluctant to leave. Quietly watching the little girl sleeping so peacefully, he admitted to himself that it was surprisingly difficult to walk away when someone so small kept drawing his attention back. Finally, the monster hunting expedition departed from the estate. After waking early to see Mr. and all the knights off, Lyonia fell asleep again almost immediately. By the time she opened her eyes once more, the sun had already climbed high across the sky. Taking her time, she leisurely got dressed before enjoying lunch. While eating, she suddenly asked whether Miss Malz had gone on the expedition too. Gavir respectfully confirmed that she had indeed accompanied the Duke. He explained that during his Grace's absence, he would personally remain behind to protect Lady Lyonia. Curious, she asked how long everyone would be gone. Gavir admitted that this year's hunt would probably take longer than usual. He explained that while the Duke had spent 3 years in the capital, the Order of Gladigo had been forced to deal with the monsters alone. Although they had reduced their numbers as much as possible, their efforts had never matched what could be accomplished when His Grace fought beside them. During the most recent breeding season in particular, the monsters had been. Gavir suddenly stopped speaking midway through the sentence, realizing what he was about to say. Lyonia immediately tilted her head and innocently asked what the monsters had been doing. Completely flustered, Gavir hurriedly corrected himself and awkwardly explained that the monsters had simply been loving each other. They had loved each other so much that their numbers had increased dramatically. Laughing innocently, Lyonia cheerfully declared that love really was amazing. Love was fantastic. Then she quietly repeated the unfinished word to herself, wondering what came after for Nick. Hearing that innocent question, Gavir felt as though his soul had momentarily left his body. Soon afterward, it was finally time for her lessons. Passing by one of the rooms, Lyonia quietly peeked through the doorway and noticed Ardea inside. Looking around the upper floors of the estate, he casually remarked that it must be difficult for someone unfamiliar with the north. Large northern estates usually had every important facility located above the 3rd floor because of the heavy snowfall each winter. Curious, Lyonia asked whether he had ever lived in the north before. Ardea calmly replied that he himself had been born there. Before she could continue asking questions, another voice politely interrupted. "Lady Lyonia, your lesson is about to begin." Countess Karina Tedros stood waiting for her with perfect posture. She gently explained that today's lesson would begin with the proper way to greet someone. She reassured Lyonia that although it might feel unfamiliar at first, she would patiently teach her everything step by step. If she ever had any questions, she should ask them immediately without hesitation. Following Karina's instructions, Lyonia carefully practiced her greeting and bowed exactly as she had been shown. Watching her, Karina's eyes widened slightly with genuine surprise. She praised Lyonia, remarking that she had never expected her to learn so quickly. Quietly listening, Lyonia found herself thinking that perhaps this woman was not quite as hung up on the past as she had first assumed. Karina honestly admitted that Lyonia's progress was incredible. To be perfectly frank, she had initially been worried. Realizing what she had almost implied, Karina immediately apologized for speaking so carelessly. She then gently smiled before explaining that although Lady Lyonia had inherited His Grace's remarkable beauty and natural charm, there was still much to polish regarding her manners and refinement. Old habits were never easy to change, but somehow she already felt that teaching Lady Lyonia was going to become an exceptionally rewarding experience. Quietly observing the elegant tutor before her, Lyonia could not help wondering whether this really was the world of a novel after all. Saying something like that to the daughter of Duke Voriotes certainly seemed like an impressively creative way to get oneself killed. "Professor, what is Countess Tedros really like?" Lyonia curiously asked. Ardea quietly looked at her for a moment before falling into thought. "Mr. only hired 2 people to educate me, yet they could not be more different." Rather than answering immediately, Ardea simply placed another book before her and calmly told her that since she could already read, she should continue reading it on her own. If she encountered anything she did not understand, she could ask him at any time, and he would gladly explain it. Listening to him, Lyonia quietly compared her 2 tutors in her mind. One of them treated the employer's daughter exactly the same as any ordinary student by testing her abilities and encouraging her to think for herself. The other constantly criticized the employer's daughter instead. Her mind drifted back to Countess Karina's words. "Your ladyship takes after His Grace in charm and beauty. However, you must compensate for your lack of inner beauty. I have a feeling that teaching you will be very rewarding." Remembering those remarks, Lyonia could only laugh inwardly from pure speechlessness. Even so, she admitted to herself that Professor Ardea remained completely devoted to his role as a teacher. At first, he had done little more than answer the countless questions she asked after reading the books he assigned to her. Every time she finished another chapter, the excitement of learning something new filled her with curiosity, causing her to bombard him with even more questions until every last doubt had disappeared from her mind. Gradually, Professor Ardea's attitude toward her began to change. Instead of waiting for her questions, he started explaining subjects she had not even reached yet. He would often ask what she thought about complicated historical events or philosophical ideas before revealing the official interpretation himself. As time passed, both the quality and the difficulty of his lessons increased noticeably. Sometimes, during meals or while enjoying afternoon snacks together, the 2 of them would even chat casually like they were doing now. After a brief silence, Ardea finally answered her original question. He explained that he remembered Countess Tedros from years ago, although at the time she had been known as Karina Mirioka. The House of Mirioka was an honorable family that possessed no fewer than 2 great estates within the imperial capital. However, unlike the old noble families of the north, they had originally moved to the capital from the empire's central region. Because of that, they were far more famous in the capital than they were in the northern territories. He continued explaining that the core noble families were those who had protected the north since the empire's earliest days, with House Vorioti standing above all of them. Anyone who studied the empire's history would discover that most of those ancient noble houses were actually branches of the Vorioti bloodline. On very rare occasions, members of those collateral families were even born possessing the fangs of the beast, just as Lady Regina had been. Ardea continued by explaining that Count Mirioka's daughter had once been an exceptionally famous figure within high society. However, beneath her graceful appearance hid something far more dangerous. There was venom within her words. She took pleasure in toying with people. Every sentence she spoke was a carefully crafted mixture of praise, sympathy, and sarcasm, allowing her scorn to slip through almost unnoticed. She was as deceptive as a snake hidden inside a basket. Wounds inflicted by cruel words were often far deeper than physical ones, and they rarely healed completely. Looking directly at Lyonia, Ardea quietly asked whether Countess Tedros had already begun doing the same to her. Lyonia calmly answered that it had already happened 3 times. During the very first weeks of etiquette lessons, Countess Tedros had smiled sweetly while implying that Lyonia remained lowly on the inside simply because she had been born a bastard child. The following week, she had reminded Lyonia that she should work much harder to repay his grace for the kindness of bringing her into House Vorioti. Then, during the 2nd week, she sarcastically remarked how fortunate Lyonia was to have been adopted by the Duke. Finally, during their most recent lesson, she had calmly declared that old habits were difficult to abandon and dismissed Lyonia by saying that no amount of effort would ever erase the fact that she had been born lowly. After recalling every one of those conversations, Lyonia found herself wondering what exactly Mr. had seen in such a woman. He had insisted that Countess Tedros was neither foolish nor clueless, yet none of her insults had managed to affect Lyonia in the slightest. Quietly laughing to herself, Lyonia reached a rather dangerous conclusion. Countess Tedros was practically begging to be killed. If that was truly what she wanted, then why should Lyonia refuse? Even so, she quickly decided that she would simply tell Mr. everything after he returned from the monster hunt. Watching the young girl remain perfectly composed despite everything, Ardea quietly observed that although Lady Lyonia was still very young, there was no doubt that she truly possessed the spirit of the Black Beast of the North. Her calm ferocity and cold determination were astonishingly similar to Duke Peliot's. The young beast was patiently crouching in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to stand, bare her fangs, and strike. If that day ever came, then perhaps it would truly mark the end of House Tedros. Later that evening, Connie gently entered Lyonia's room to prepare everything for the night. She kindly asked whether her bed was comfortable enough and whether there was anything making her uncomfortable. Lyonia smiled and answered that everything was perfectly fine. Connie reminded her to ring the enchanted bell if she needed anything during the night. Lyonia happily agreed before wishing Connie a good night. After Connie quietly left the room, Lyonia climbed into bed and tried to fall asleep. Before long, however, she sat back up and reached for the large collection of strawberry milk candies the Duke had given her over time. One by one, she carefully counted every single candy she had earned for doing cute things. 697, 698, 699, 700. By the time she finished counting, she realized she possessed far more candies than the actual number of days she had spent living at the Vorioti estate. Holding one of the sweets in her hand, she quietly reflected on everything that had happened since arriving in this strange world. One day she had opened her eyes only to discover that she had become a frail little orphan. Somehow, through an unbelievable stroke of luck, she had met the male lead of the novel, been adopted into House Vorioti, and become the cherished daughter of one of the most powerful men in the empire. She was well fed, cared for, and surrounded by people who genuinely looked after her. Sometimes, it all felt so unreal that it seemed more like a dream than reality. Quietly hugging the jar of strawberry milk candies close to herself, Lyonia found herself wishing that Mr. would return home soon. She missed him far more than she wanted to admit. Gradually, sleep overtook her once again. Just before drifting off completely, another thought suddenly crossed her mind. Tomorrow. She still had another etiquette lesson with Countess Tedros.